Welcome. Get comfortable. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, whatever kind of day you had, you can put it down for a while. We are going to spend the next few hours in Springfield, and Springfield, strange and impossible and quietly unsettling as it is, has a way of making everything else feel very far away. This is a ranked journey through every major mystery the show has ever left unresolved, every buried storyline, every contradiction the writers planted and never addressed. Every theory so carefully constructed that the people who made the show have had to sit down and respond to it in interviews. We are going all the way from mild to completely unhinged, building slowly, letting each mystery settle before we move to the next one. The mysteries are ranked by how strange they get. We start with the things that seem like simple curiosities, small oddities you might have noticed and dismissed without thinking too hard about them. And we end somewhere much darker, somewhere the show has been quietly pointing for 36 years without ever saying it out loud. So settle in, dim the lights if you have not already. Let your breathing slow down. Springfield is waiting. Section 1. Level 1. The town that does not exist on any map. Craziness rating, 2 out of 10. We start with the mystery that sounds the simplest and turns out, the longer you sit with it, to be one of the most deliberately constructed puzzles in television history. Where is Springfield? That is the question. On the surface, it seems like a question with an obvious answer, or at least an answer that should be findable. The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989, 36 seasons, close to 800 episodes. The town has been described in enough detail over that run that you could theoretically map it from memory. There is a nuclear power plant on the edge of town. There is a harbor. There is a gorge. There is a mountain range visible on the horizon on certain days. There is a tire fire that has been burning for as long as anyone can remember, out past the edge of the residential neighborhoods, its orange glow visible from the freeway. Springfield has a monorail, though the monorail famously does not work as intended. It has 2 hospitals, an elementary school, a high school, a prison, a stadium, a beach, and a quickie mart on what appears to be a corner lot a few blocks from the Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace. You could draw this town. Plenty of fans have. And yet, despite all of that, despite 36 years of geographic detail, nobody can tell you what state Springfield is in. The show has been asked this question hundreds of times. Matt Groening, the creator, has been asked this question in what must feel like every interview he has ever given, and the answer has never been straightforward, because the show does not want to give a straightforward answer. The geographic uncertainty of Springfield is not an oversight. It is a decision, made deliberately and maintained with remarkable consistency across hundreds of episodes and dozens of writing staffs. Here is what makes it strange. Most long-running shows that feature a fictional town simply pick a state and stick with it. Springfield on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is in California. Stars Hollow on Gilmore Girls is in Connecticut. Pawnee on Parks and Recreation is in Indiana. The state is part of the texture of the place. It shapes the culture, the weather, the landscape, the sensibility of the characters who grew up there. It grounds the fiction in something real. Springfield refuses to be grounded. In one episode, Springfield is clearly in the north, somewhere cold enough for regular blizzard conditions. In another, it is sunny and coastal, with the kind of warm ocean that suggests a southern latitude. Lisa's area code, shown briefly in one episode, begins with 636, which is a Missouri exchange. The state abbreviation on official documents has occasionally appeared as NT, which is not a real state abbreviation for any current American state. In one episode, Homer calls the state capital and the voice on the phone tells him the state is one that begins with a vowel, which narrows the possibilities while still leaving multiple candidates viable. The show has placed Springfield within driving distance of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you are watching. In some episodes, there are palm trees. In others, there is tundra. The town has an active volcano within sight of the suburbs in at least one episode. It borders a desert in another. The same town, the same streets, the same yellow family in the same house. And here is the detail that really makes you pause. Springfield does not just have inconsistent geography across episodes. It has impossible geography within episodes. In a single story, characters will drive from their neighborhood to what is clearly an ocean beach in a few minutes, and then in the same episode reference a mountain range that is close enough to hike to after school. No real American town can be simultaneously coastal, mountainous, landlocked, and adjacent to both desert and farmland. The combination of geographic features Springfield contains could not physically coexist in a single location anywhere in the continental United States. Springfield does not exist in any state because Springfield exists in all of them at once. Now, the simple explanation is obvious. It is a cartoon. Continuity about geography is not the point. The writers need a beach episode, so there is a beach. They need a mountain episode, so there is a mountain. They are not constructing a geographically coherent world. They are building sets for jokes. The location of Springfield is irrelevant to whether the jokes land. That explanation is partially true, but it does not account for the deliberateness of the ambiguity. Because the writers have not simply ignored the question of Springfield's location, they have actively worked to prevent it from being answered. Every time a piece of evidence appears that seems to lock Springfield into a specific state, another piece of evidence appears shortly afterward in a different episode that contradicts it. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. Someone, across multiple writing staffs spanning 3.5 decades, has been maintaining the uncertainty on purpose. The clues that appear to answer the question are themselves part of the puzzle. They are planted to keep you looking, to keep the question alive, to prevent any single answer from settling long enough to become established fact. Matt Groening in 2012 gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine in which he finally seemed to answer the question. He said he named the town Springfield after Springfield, Oregon. He grew up near it. He chose it because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, present in dozens of states, which was exactly the kind of universality he was going for. For a brief window of about 48 hours, the internet declared the mystery solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Then the show continued airing episodes that contradicted this. The writers did not honor Groening's confession. They kept introducing geographic details inconsistent with Oregon's actual landscape and climate. The official answer dissolved almost immediately under the weight of the show's own subsequent content. There is a version of this mystery where the explanation really is as simple as Groening's darts analogy. Throw enough darts at enough states, and eventually none of them stick, and the town becomes universal. The show was designed to feel like every viewer's hometown, so locking it to a specific state would have undermined that. Springfield is meant to be yours, wherever you are, whatever landscape you grew up in. Giving it a real state would have made it someone else's. That is the intent. That is what the writers have said. But the theories that have grown up around Springfield's location over the years have developed a much stranger reading of the ambiguity, and that reading becomes more compelling the longer you think about it. Here is the question the straightforward explanation does not quite answer. Why does it matter that Springfield cannot be located? Not to the viewers, but within the world of the show. Within the logic of Springfield itself, what does it mean that the town exists outside of normal geographic accountability? Think about the nuclear power plant. The Springfield nuclear power plant is, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most dangerously mismanaged industrial facilities ever depicted in fiction. It has been cited for over 300 safety violations. It dumps radioactive waste directly into public waterways. Its cooling towers have been repaired with chewing gum. The safety inspector responsible for preventing catastrophe is a man with documented cognitive impairment who has caused multiple nuclear incidents through carelessness. This facility operates in flagrant violation of every applicable environmental and safety regulation. In the real world, a facility like that would be shut down by federal regulators within days of its problems being discovered. The EPA would intervene. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission would intervene. The state attorney general would intervene. There would be congressional hearings. There would be lawsuits filed on behalf of every resident living in the vicinity. But for any of that to happen, someone would need to be able to definitively establish which state Springfield is in, which EPA regional office has jurisdiction, which state environmental agency has the authority to act, which court system has the power to hear the case. If Springfield has no fixed state, it has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent oversight, no permanent jurisdiction. It slips between the cracks of every administrative boundary that might otherwise hold it accountable. The town with no location is the town that cannot be regulated. The power plant with no fixed address is the power plant that cannot be shut down. Springfield floats between states because floating is protection. Landing means accountability. Landing means someone shows up with federal authority and a warrant and starts asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who has somehow been alive since before the turn of the 20th century. As long as Springfield has no fixed coordinates, the questions cannot follow it home. There is another layer to this mystery that sits closer to the surface of the show but rarely gets examined directly. Springfield is described repeatedly across its run as the most common city name in America. There are Springfields in Illinois and Oregon and Missouri and Ohio and dozens of other states. The name belongs everywhere and therefore nowhere specific. That was a conscious choice by Groening. But what it created, inadvertently or not, is a town that functions like a mirror. Springfield reflects back whatever the viewer brings to it. If you grew up in a small, Rust Belt town with a depressed economy and a dominant employer, Springfield is that. If you grew up in a mid-sized suburban sprawl with a downtown that never quite recovered from the 70s, Springfield is that too. If you grew up in a coastal community where the weather was warm and the local economy depended on a single industry, Springfield fits that as well. The town reshapes itself to match its audience, and that reshaping requires the absence of fixed geographic coordinates. You cannot be everyone's hometown if you are already someone's hometown. So Springfield remains unlocatable. The question stays open. The show keeps planting contradictory clues, and the fans keep trying to reconcile them, and nobody ever wins. The mystery sustains itself through its own impossibility. And if you let yourself sit with it long enough, in the quiet space before sleep, that impossibility starts to feel like something more than a production convenience. A town with no address. A community that cannot be found on any map. A place that exists just outside the reach of the systems that would otherwise govern it. Real enough to feel familiar. Unreal enough to evade every question that familiarity might invite. Springfield is everywhere. Springfield is nowhere. And somehow, both of those things are true at the same time. If you are still awake right now, drop a comment with your location and the time. It is something quiet and grounding to do before you drift off. And if you are finding this relaxing, a subscription keeps the light on. Section 2. Level 2, the predictions phenomenon. Craziness, rating 3 out of 10. There is a specific kind of feeling that comes over you when you are scrolling through a social media feed late at night and you see a screenshot from an old Simpsons episode placed side by side with a recent news headline. It is not quite surprise. It is something closer to a low-grade unease, the specific discomfort of watching a pattern form out of what should be noise. The Simpsons predicted this. Again, you have seen these posts. Everyone has seen these posts. They circulate with a regularity that says something interesting about the internet's relationship with this show, but we will get to that. First, the facts. In the year 2000, The Simpsons episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future timeline in which Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States. In the background of the episode, barely treated as a punchline, the script established that Lisa's predecessor in the Oval Office was Donald Trump. The joke was that a Trump presidency had left the country in such severe financial ruin that Lisa was inheriting a disaster. It was a throwaway gag about the absurdity of celebrity politics taken to its logical extreme. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 presidential election. 16 years. The screenshot went everywhere. In a 1995 episode, a character used a device that bore a notable resemblance to what we now call a smartwatch, with a wrist-mounted display showing communications and time. The Apple Watch would not exist for another 2 decades. In a 1994 episode, Homer went to space alongside Buzz Aldrin, years before private space tourism became a serious commercial enterprise. In a 1998 episode, a brief shot included a mathematical equation on a chalkboard that, according to physicists who examined it after the fact, appeared to predict the approximate mass of the Higgs boson particle. The Higgs boson would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposed a theory that the universe was shaped like a donut. The episode played this as an absurdist joke about Homer's limited cosmological knowledge. Years later, certain cosmological radiation patterns suggested the universe might actually have a toroidal or donut-like geometry. The joke turned out to be closer to cutting-edge theoretical physics than it had any right to be. In 1993, An episode called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia that spread rapidly across Springfield, causing mass panic, runs on medical supplies, and a frantic scramble for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic. And during the fictional outbreak in that episode, the panicked townspeople accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which felt disturbingly prescient when Asian giant hornets, nicknamed murder hornets by the media, appeared in the United States during the actual 2020 pandemic. In 1996, an episode called Homerpalooza featured a joke in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra while under the influence. That collaboration actually happened. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall, 28 years between the joke and the reality. In 1998, an episode depicted the media company 20th Century Fox being acquired by a much larger entertainment conglomerate. In 2019, Disney purchased 20th Century Fox. The Simpsons, which is a Fox property, depicted its own parent company being absorbed by Disney more than 20 years before it actually happened. The list is long enough to fill its own dedicated video. Every few months, something happens in the world and someone finds a Simpsons clip from 15 or 20 or 25 years ago that seems to have anticipated it, and the cycle begins again. So, how do you explain it? The people who actually make the show have a consistent answer, and it is worth hearing before we get into the stranger interpretations. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons since its earliest seasons, addressed the phenomenon directly, and his explanation was about as unromantic as possible. He said that if you throw enough darts, some of them are going to hit the bullseye. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains a significant number of jokes, references, and satirical observations about the direction of American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that volume of predictive content over that length of time, some percentage of it will align with future events through statistical probability alone, the same way a sufficiently large library of fortune cookie messages will eventually contain one that matches every life event you will ever experience. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, put it differently. He said most of what gets called a Simpsons prediction is actually just history repeating itself. The episodes are old enough that the situations they satirized have had time to recycle. The specific circumstances that inspired a joke in 1996 will, given enough decades, be replicated in a new form, and when that happens, the original joke looks prophetic, even though it was actually just observational. These are honest, credible explanations from people with direct knowledge of how the show was made. And for the vast majority of what gets called a Simpsons prediction, they are probably right. Confirmation bias does enormous work here. Nobody screenshots the Simpsons jokes that never came true, and there are thousands of them. Jokes about jetpacks that never got built, predictions about political outcomes that went the other way, satirical observations about cultural trends that reversed or simply never materialized. The failed predictions vanish into the archive while the successful ones circulate forever, creating a highlight reel that looks miraculous precisely because it has been filtered. The internet does not remember misses. The internet only remembers hits. When you add that filter to a show with nearly 800 episodes, each one dense with satirical content, you end up with something that looks less like prophecy and more like an extremely well-curated retrospective. We are seeing the best of collection, not the full catalog. That is the rational explanation. It is probably correct for most cases, but then there are the ones that are harder to file away. The Trump prediction did not just forecast that a celebrity might one day run for president. It named Trump specifically. And the episode depicted him descending an escalator in a visual sequence that closely mirrors the actual moment from 2015 when Trump came down the escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy. The show did not just get the person right, it got the staging right. That level of specificity is harder to attribute to pure statistical coincidence. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just make a vague joke about dangerous exotic animals. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers in a show very much like theirs, which is almost exactly what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers during a live performance. The specificity again gives you pause. There is a version of the prediction phenomenon that is more interesting than any conspiracy theory about time travel or supernatural foresight, and it is this. The Simpsons does not predict the future so much as it shapes it. The show has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have entered the American lexicon. Its observations have become part of the framework through which American culture understands itself. When The Simpsons depicts a Trump presidency 16 years before it happens, that depiction enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people watch it. The idea of Trump as president becomes a cultural artifact, a joke, a reference point. It gets repeated and shared and referenced. It normalizes the idea in the collective imagination, not in a way that makes it more likely to happen exactly, but in a way that makes it feel less shocking when it does. The joke does not predict the future. The joke makes the future feel familiar. When reality catches up to The Simpsons, the audience does not experience pure surprise. They experience recognition. There is a sense of course, we have been here before. The show already told us this was coming, and that recognition, that feeling of having been culturally prepared for an outcome, is what gets mistaken for prophecy. The show is not seeing ahead. The show is saturating the culture with images of certain possible futures, and those images, once absorbed, change how those futures are perceived when they arrive. Springfield does not reflect America from a distance. America has, in some measurable way, become Springfield. The show held a mirror up to the culture for 36 years, and the culture spent so long staring into it that the reflection started to look like the real thing. There is one final piece of the prediction mystery that tends to get overlooked in the excitement about the accurate ones. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most educated in American television. Multiple writers hold degrees from elite universities. Several have backgrounds in mathematics, theoretical physics, computer science, and political science. These are not people making random guesses about the future. They are deeply informed observers of American culture who spend their professional lives studying trends, analyzing historical patterns, and thinking carefully about where current trajectories lead. When they wrote the Trump joke in 2000, Trump had already been publicly flirting with running for president for more than a decade. The satirical logic was not prediction so much as extrapolation. Take a trend already in motion, which was the creeping influence of celebrity culture on political life, and push it to its most absurd possible conclusion. The conclusion happened to be accurate because the trend they were extrapolating was real and continued moving in the direction they expected. When they depicted media consolidation in the form of Disney absorbing Fox, media consolidation was already an accelerating trend with visible momentum. When they depicted surveillance technology and video calling and wrist-mounted computers, the miniaturization of technology was already underway, and the direction it was heading was legible to anyone paying close attention. The Simpsons did not predict the future. The Simpsons read the present more carefully than anyone else, wrote it down, and then waited for the rest of the world to catch up. That is the unglamorous truth behind the prediction phenomenon. It is less magical than time travel and more impressive than coincidence. It is the product of unusually talented people doing unusually rigorous observational work for an unusually long time. But it does not quite explain the escalator, and it does not quite explain the white tiger, and it does not quite explain why. Every few months without fail, something happens in the world and someone finds a Simpsons clip that seems to have been waiting for it. Even knowing how the trick works, it is still impressive to watch. Section 3. Level 3 Who Really Shot Mr. Burns? Craziness rating? 4 out of 10. The official answer is Maggie. Baby Maggie Simpson, 1-year-old, stumbled across a gun in a parking lot and accidentally discharged it into the chest of the richest man in Springfield, who had at that point done more damage to the community than any single individual in the show's history. Chief Wiggum investigated. The evidence was examined. Burns himself woke from a coma and identified the shooter, and the case was closed. Case closed. Baby did it. Move on. Except the longer you look at the evidence, the less settled the case feels. This mystery deserves some setup, because the context is everything. The summer of 1995 was the last time a television show genuinely captured the entire country's attention, the way scripted dramas used to before streaming fragmented everything. The Simpsons ran a two-part episode called Who Shot Mr. Burns, structured as a genuine mystery, designed with enough clues and red herrings that viewers could theoretically solve it before the answer aired 3 months later. Fox promoted it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted ran a tie-in special treating the fictional crime like an actual unsolved case. The show invited viewers to participate in a national contest, with the prize being animation into a future episode. Millions of people submitted their guesses. When the answer was revealed in September of 1995, it was Maggie, and something felt slightly off to a meaningful number of viewers, though articulating exactly what was off took a little longer. Here is what had happened to motivate the shooting. Mr. Burns, in the weeks leading up to the mystery, had gone on what can only be described as an uncharacteristic rampage. He discovered an oil deposit beneath Springfield Elementary School and drilled it out, siphoning the school's financial foundation. He drove Moe's Tavern into bankruptcy by engineering a financial squeeze on its owner. He created a sinkhole that swallowed the Springfield retirement castle. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. And then, for reasons that made sense only in the logic of a man with unlimited resources and a total indifference to the well-being of others, he built a device that blocked the sun over Springfield. Not symbolically. He literally blocked the sun. Every resident of Springfield was forced into artificial darkness, unable to grow food, unable to generate solar power, unable to function normally, all so that Burns could force them to purchase their electricity exclusively from his nuclear power plant. Smithers, Burns's endlessly loyal personal assistant, protested this. Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of Part 1, the entire town of Springfield had a reason to want Burns dead. Every single character. The show took careful time establishing individual motives for a long list of suspects. Homer, because Burns had been unable to remember his name despite Homer having worked for him for years. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its funding. Grandpa, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because Burns's actions cost him his job. Tito Puente, who had a music scholarship eliminated. Moe, whose bar collapsed under financial pressure, Burns engineered. Even Smithers, freshly terminated and drinking heavily. The entire town gathered at a public meeting. Multiple characters were shown with weapons. Burns arrived and collapsed, shot with his own gun. He landed on the town's sundial, his hands pointing to two letters that would become the central clue. The letters were W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective, looking up at the dial from where he had fallen, M and S. The show wanted you to read this as Maggie Simpson. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. And here is the first crack in the official explanation. Burns himself, when he woke from the coma and described the shooting, specifically stated that his hands falling on those letters was not intentional. He did not arrange himself on the sundial to spell out a clue. He simply fell. The positioning was coincidental. The central piece of physical evidence in the case was explicitly described by the victim as meaningless. Then there is the gun itself. Before the shooting, Burns's holster was shown on camera as empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. This is significant. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon, which means the shooter was someone who came upon the gun after it had already been separated from Burns. Someone who did not come to the town meeting carrying a weapon of their own. Most of the suspects with the strongest motives came armed. Homer was seen with a gun. Groundskeeper Willie had tools. Several characters were shown holding objects that could function as weapons. The profile of the actual shooter, based on the physical evidence, is someone who was not planning violence that evening, who encountered Burns's gun by chance, and who acted impulsively in the moment, rather than with premeditation. A baby encountering a gun on the ground fits that profile reasonably well. So do roughly a dozen other characters who were present at the meeting and not carrying weapons. Burns's last words before he was shot were, quote, "Oh, it's you, not who are you? Not what are you doing here?" He recognized his attacker. He addressed them as a familiar presence, someone he had encountered before, someone whose appearance in the parking lot at that moment did not alarm him. Does Burns know Maggie Simpson? Has he, before this episode, had any meaningful interaction with her? The show does not establish a prior relationship between Burns and Maggie. Burns can barely remember Homer's name, and Homer has worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would greet a one-year-old infant with the specific phrase, "Oh, it's you," the phrasing of someone acknowledging a known quantity, is hard to square with a man who routinely fails to recognize his own longtime employees. Then there is Homer's confession. In a season 18 episode, years after the original mystery was resolved, Homer casually states that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it directly, on screen, without particular drama, and the show does nothing with it. Nobody investigates, nobody reopens the case. Homer Simpson confesses to the attempted murder of the richest man in Springfield, and the moment passes like a throwaway comment. The writers could have framed this as Homer being confused, or joking, or misremembering. Instead, they left it sitting there, unresolved, an unexploded ordnance in the middle of a regular episode. Either Homer is lying for attention, which would be consistent with his character, or the original verdict was wrong and Homer knows it, because he is the one who actually pulled the trigger. If Homer did it, then Maggie was framed. A one-year-old infant was identified as the perpetrator of a crime committed by her father, and the entire Springfield justice system, such as it is, accepted that conclusion without meaningful scrutiny. The most compelling alternative theory to surface in the years since the episode aired centers on Marge. Marge Simpson had watched Burns dismantle her children's school. She had watched him injure her family's dog. She had watched him steal the sun from her entire community. She had both the motive and the emotional capacity for the act. And the theorist who developed this reading of the evidence noted something else. Burns fell in love with Marge in a season 5 episode. He pursued her. He was genuinely infatuated with her. Under this reading, Burns recognized Marge in the parking lot and said, "Oh, it's you," in exactly the tone of a man encountering a woman he had feelings for. Marge shot him. Burns woke up, looked around the hospital room, understood who had done it, and chose to protect her. He pointed the investigation toward the sundial and let the town draw its own conclusions, knowing that Maggie was too young to be prosecuted and that his protection of Marge would remain invisible behind the convenient absurdity of a baby being blamed. Chief Wiggum says it himself. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie was the perfect fall person for whoever actually pulled the trigger. Too young to deny the accusation. Too young to understand what she was being accused of. Too young to ever face consequences. If someone within Springfield's power structure wanted to protect the real shooter, blaming Maggie was clean and simple and untouchable. There is also the matter of what the show did with the national contest. Fox invited millions of viewers to submit their guesses and promised that the winner, the person who correctly identified the shooter from the clues in Part 1, would be animated into a future episode. According to the DVD commentary for the episodes, not a single person in the randomly selected sample of entries submitted the correct answer. Nobody won. The prize was awarded randomly from the pool of entrants, and because no one had the right answer, the winner received cash instead of their animation cameo. A show that designed its mystery as solvable from the evidence, then promoted a national contest around that solubility, then revealed an answer that essentially no one had correctly guessed. The writers acknowledged in that same commentary that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup on the night of the original broadcast, a college student using a university internet account. By the time the contest concluded and the producers tried to locate this person, the account was inactive. They could not find the one person who got it right. The alternate ending exists. A fully produced, fully voiced, complete conclusion in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. It was shown on the 138th episode Spectacular, hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses it by saying it would not have made sense because all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which he describes as downright nutty. That line is a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which was simultaneously consuming the American public's attention in 1995, in which a jury set aside DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show was winking at the audience. It was saying, explicitly, that ignoring DNA evidence happens, that the official answer is not always the right one, that the evidence can point wherever the people with power want it to point. An early draft had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers seriously considered sending him to prison as a way of finally doing something interesting with his character. This was eventually abandoned, but its existence reveals something important. The answer was not built from the clues forward. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was reverse engineered, which means the clues are not as carefully calibrated to the correct answer as the show wants you to believe. The official verdict is Maggie Simpson. But the contest nobody won, the clues the victim himself described as coincidental, the alternate ending that was fully produced, Homer's unaddressed Season 18 confession, and the suspicious phrasing of Burns's last conscious words all suggest that the greatest mystery in Simpsons history was never actually solved. It was closed. In Springfield, those two things are not the same. Section 4. Level 4, Ned Flanders and the Psychology of Programmed Goodness. Craziness rating, 5 out of 10. On the surface, Ned Flanders is the simplest character in Springfield. He is Homer's neighbor. He is kind where Homer is selfish. He is devout where Homer is irreverent. He is patient where Homer is impulsive. He is physically fit, financially responsible, emotionally available to his children, generous with his time, and genuinely, consistently, relentlessly decent. Every quality that Homer lacks, Ned possesses in abundance. He is the better version. The foil. The straight man to Homer's chaos. That is the surface reading. But the show spent 36 years quietly dismantling that reading, episode by episode, until Ned Flanders became something far more complicated and far more haunting than a simple counterpoint to Homer's dysfunction. Let us start with what happened to his wife. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife and the mother of his two sons, was killed during a Springfield Speedway racing event. A t-shirt cannon misfired, and the projectile knocked her off the bleachers. She died from the impact of a promotional item being launched into a crowd. Here is the detail the show includes without making a particular fuss about it. Homer was the proximate cause. Homer was seated in the bleachers near Maud. When the t-shirts were being fired into the crowd, Homer dodged the ones aimed at him, causing the trajectory of the launched shirts to shift. One of the shirts that Homer evaded struck Maud instead. Homer's reflexive self-preservation, his instinct to protect himself from a harmless promotional giveaway, created the conditions for his neighbor's wife to be killed, and Ned forgave him. Not after a long struggle, not with visible effort and residual resentment. Ned forgave Homer with what appeared to be genuine grace, consistent with his stated faith and his character as the show had established it. He grieved Maud, he raised his two sons alone, and he maintained his relationship with the man whose actions had caused her death without apparent bitterness. For several seasons, this looked like a portrait of genuine spiritual depth. Ned was demonstrating something rare on television, a character who actually lived according to his stated values rather than merely performing them. Then came the hurricane episode. A devastating storm rolled through Springfield and destroyed multiple homes in the community. Among them was Ned's. The town rallied to rebuild it, which on the surface sounded like a heartwarming community response. But the resulting structure, built by untrained volunteers working quickly and without adequate materials, was structurally catastrophic. Within moments of being completed and presented to Ned with community celebration, the house collapsed entirely, leaving him with nothing but the rubble. Ned snapped. What came out of him in that moment had clearly been building for a long time. He screamed at the town. He insulted people by name. He said things about every person who had ever wronged him, phrased with a specificity and an anger that made it clear these were not sudden impulses, but accumulated grievances that had been contained under enormous pressure for an enormous amount of time. The performance of patience and grace had been exactly that, a performance. What lived underneath it was something rawer and more volatile. He was institutionalized. And during his treatment at the mental health facility, the show revealed something that reframes everything about Ned Flanders that came before it. As a child, Ned was not kind. He was not patient. He was not gracious. He was the opposite, a violent, uncontrollable child who could not be managed by conventional means. His parents, free-spirited people who did not believe in discipline or structure, were at a complete loss. They took him to a psychiatrist who spent years working with young Ned using intensive behavioral modification techniques. The treatment worked in the narrow sense that it eliminated the problematic behaviors. Ned became calm. He became gentle. He became the relentlessly positive person Springfield would come to know and depend on as a kind of moral anchor. But the way it worked matters enormously. The treatment did not teach Ned to feel differently. It taught him not to express certain feelings. The rage, the frustration, the anger at being treated unfairly and watching goodness go unrewarded, none of that was resolved. It was suppressed, locked away behind behavioral conditioning that prevented him from accessing or expressing it under normal circumstances. Ned's kindness is not a character trait that developed naturally from his values and his experiences. It is a cage, a structure built around a much more volatile interior, designed to keep that interior contained and to prevent it from expressing itself regardless of the provocation. His patience with Homer is not spiritual fortitude. It is a conditioned inability to respond to anger with anger. His forgiveness after Maud's death is not grace. It is the programmed response of someone whose behavioral architecture makes certain emotional responses inaccessible. His faith is not conviction born of spiritual experience. It is the framework that an intelligent, emotionally suppressed person built to explain why he keeps suffering without being allowed to respond to his suffering in any way that might actually relieve it. The show knows this. When the conditioning fails, briefly, we see what it is containing. And the despair that surfaces in those moments is bottomless in a way that the show does not quite have language for. Ned Flanders, when his cage opens, does not become violent in a physical sense. He becomes honest. He says the things he has never been allowed to say. He names the wounds. And the honesty is more disturbing than violence would have been, because it is so clearly the truth about a person who has spent his entire life successfully hiding the truth about himself. Here is the piece that the show drops almost in passing, that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. God talks to Homer. This is canonical. In multiple episodes, Homer has face-to-face conversations with God. God appears to him. God speaks to him. In the Season 4 premiere, God has an extended theological conversation with Homer while Homer is lying on the couch during an impromptu Sabbath he has invented for himself. God does not seem to find Homer's laziness or irreverence particularly disqualifying. They chat. They reach an understanding. God leaves Homer with something meaningful. In the Treehouse of Horror episodes, in dream sequences, in moments of crisis and transcendence, Homer has repeated direct access to the divine presence that Ned has staked his entire identity on. Ned never does. Ned, who attends church every week without exception, who prays with regularity and sincerity, who has organized his entire life around his faith, who has suffered losses that would break most people and responded with trust in a plan he cannot see, who has done everything a devoted believer is supposed to do and more, Ned has never once received the divine acknowledgement he has dedicated his life to seeking. Homer gets God, Ned gets silence. The drunk, selfish, impulsive man who falls asleep in church and has caused more harm to the people around him than almost any other character in the show receives repeated divine conversation. The devout, giving, genuinely good-hearted man who has subordinated his entire emotional life to the service of his faith receives nothing. This is not random. The show is making a point with this contrast, even if it never states the point directly. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Compliance is rewarded. Compliance with the social order, compliance with the economic system, compliance with the expectations of the people around you. And Ned is the most perfectly compliant person in town, because he was conditioned to be compliant before he was old enough to choose otherwise. Homer does whatever he wants. Homer suffers the minimum consequences and recovers fully. Homer is beloved and forgiven and central to every story. Homer receives divine attention. Ned does everything right. Ned loses his wife. Ned loses his house. Ned's generosity is taken for granted, and his forgiveness is exploited. Ned is peripheral to most stories. Ned receives silence. The gap between them has never narrowed. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years, and nothing about the differential treatment they receive from the universe has shifted in either direction. The show does not offer this as a criticism of faith exactly. It offers it as a portrait of a specific kind of suffering, the suffering of a person who was denied access to their own inner life at a formative age, who built an identity from the materials of religion and community goodwill because those were the only structures available to them, and who pours that identity continuously into a world that takes it for granted without ever examining why the pouring never seems to fill anything up. Ned Flanders is not the nicest man in Springfield. Ned Flanders is Springfield's most successfully contained person. and the machinery that contains him has never once loosened its grip, except that one time in the hurricane aftermath, when the weight of everything became briefly heavier than the conditioning could hold. The cage held, the hurricane aftermath resolved. Ned came back from the institution, resumed his life, resumed his faith, resumed his patience, resumed his position next door to the man who killed his wife, and never quite understood what he had done. And there is something deeply, quietly heartbreaking about that. Not the tragedy of suffering. That is everywhere in fiction. The specific heartbreak of someone who has been so successfully programmed that they cannot quite reach the suffering that is rightfully theirs. Someone for whom even grief, even anger, even the most basic human right to feel the weight of what has happened to them has been placed slightly out of reach by the architecture of their own mind. That is Ned Flanders. Good night, Ned. Section 5. Level 5. Hans Moleman and the Immortal Victim. Craziness rating, 5.5 out of 10. Hans Moleman is a very small, very old, very nearly blind man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists functionally to die. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals. He gets struck by lightning while standing in exposed locations that no reasonable person would choose to occupy during a lightning storm. He gets incinerated. He walks into traffic with a serene expression and disappears under the wheels. He is, by any conservative count, the most frequently killed recurring character in the history of American animation. The show has killed Hans Moleman dozens of times in canonical, non-dream, non-special episode contexts. Regular episodes, regular Springfield. Moleman dies and then he appears in the next episode completely fine, with no explanation, no resurrection scene, no acknowledgement from any other character that anything out of the ordinary has occurred. He simply comes back, ready to die again. Springfield's most reliable fatality, cycling through death and return like a background process that nobody has ever thought to examine. Most fans have encountered this and filed it under running gag. Moleman dies a lot. It is funny. The repetition is the joke. Nobody is meant to think about it. But then Moleman mentioned his age, casually, in a throwaway line that the show clearly did not intend to be analyzed. He said he was 31 years old. 31. Hans Moleman appears to be somewhere in his 80s. His hair, what remains of it, is white. His face is deeply lined. His posture is that of a man whose skeleton has been in continuous use for far longer than the average human skeleton. His vision is so poor that he requires thick-lensed glasses that give his eyes a magnified, slightly fish-like appearance. Everything about his physical presentation suggests a man in extreme old age, well past the typical human lifespan. If he is telling the truth about being 31, and there is no in-universe reason to believe he was lying, then something aged Hans Moleman catastrophically. Something took a man at the early peak of his adult life and turned him into a walking embodiment of advanced senescence before he hit middle age. Something did this to him so completely that he presents as elderly in his early 30s, and something additionally made him nearly indestructible despite that apparent frailty, because he keeps dying and coming back. Those two facts sit next to each other in a way that is genuinely strange once you start thinking about it. He looks ancient. He cannot be killed permanently. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The radiation theory has the most straightforward explanation for Moleman's condition. If the Springfield nuclear power plant has been leaking radioactive contamination into the town's environment for decades, and if that contamination affects different people in different ways depending on their biology, proximity to the source, and individual cellular response, then Moleman might represent a case where the radiation's effects on aging were accelerated dramatically, while simultaneously altering his cellular regeneration in a way that prevents permanent death. The same nuclear exposure that mutated Blinky the fish to grow a third eye might have mutated Moleman's biology in a way that aged his appearance catastrophically, while somehow preserving the regenerative function of his tissue. He looks like he has lived 100 years and 30 because, biologically, something in his cellular structure has been running at 100 times the normal rate. And whatever that acceleration did to his appearance, it created as a side effect a kind of biological resilience that makes death a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent state. The coma theory offers a different reading. In Homer's dream, minor characters are background processes. They exist to populate the simulation with enough human texture to make the dream feel real. Homer does not care enough about Mulman to maintain him consistently between dream cycles. When Mulman dies, Homer's sleeping brain simply lets him lapse and then regenerates him when the next scene requires a familiar face in the crowd. Mulman's deaths are not narrative events in the dream. They are brief interruptions in a subroutine. He is not a person in the dream. He is furniture that occasionally needs to be replaced. Under the collective denial framework, Mulman's repeated deaths are just another item on Springfield's long list of things the community has agreed not to notice. A man dies publicly, in front of witnesses, with regularity. Nobody calls this a crisis. Nobody investigates. Nobody asks the obvious questions about why this keeps happening and why it keeps not staying happened. Springfield normalized the three-eyed fish. It normalized the billionaire who glows. It normalized the principal who turns out to be a complete fabrication. Mulman's death cycle is simply another irregularity that the town's social contract has designated as beneath comment. What all three of these interpretations share is the sense that Mulman's existence within Springfield's ecosystem is not accidental. He is not just a joke character who happens to get hurt a lot. He is a data point in a larger pattern. A resident of a town where the rules governing human biology and death seem to operate differently than they do everywhere else. A man whose age does not match his appearance, whose mortality does not stick, whose continued presence in a town where he should long since have either died or aged into someone who looks 31, is one more piece of evidence that something in Springfield has broken the normal flow of cause and effect. The show does not want you to think about Hans Mulman. He is background, he is gag, he is there to fall down and get back up. But the fact that he always gets back up is interesting. The fact that he never seems to age, despite having started at what appeared to be extreme old age, is interesting. The fact that he once told us he was 31 years old, in a moment the show treated as a throwaway, and then never mentioned it again. That is interesting too. Section 6, Level 6, Maggie Simpson and the Intelligence Behind the Silence. Craziness rating, 6 out of 10. Maggie Simpson does not speak. She makes sounds. She expresses herself through the movement of her pacifier and the range of her enormous dark eyes. She communicates with more emotional nuance than most of the adults in her life, but she does it without language. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She has not developed speech beyond a handful of documented moments that the show has treated as singular exceptions rather than the beginning of an ongoing pattern. Her first word, daddy, was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in what amounted to a cameo, and it happened once and was never followed by a second word. For 36 years, the Simpson family's youngest member has existed in near total silence, surrounded by some of the most verbally active people in television. Homer never stops talking. Marge narrates her anxieties aloud in real time. Bart fills every available silence with provocation. Lisa lectures, argues, and articulates with the precision of someone who has been practicing her adult voice since she was 8. The Simpson household is a wall of constant noise, an overlapping conversation that never pauses. And in the middle of it, Maggie watches. The easy reading is developmental. She is 1 year old. 1 year olds do not talk much. The Simpsons uses a floating timeline that prevents all its characters from aging, and Maggie's silence is simply the fixed characteristic of a child locked permanently at 12 months. She will not develop language because she cannot age into the developmental stage where language typically emerges. But the show keeps undercutting this reading. Over and over, across multiple episodes and a theatrical short film, the show demonstrates that Maggie's silence is not the silence of someone who cannot communicate. It is the silence of someone who has chosen not to. The distinction is enormous. The Longest Daycare is a theatrical short film released in 2012, screened in cinemas before a feature film. It was nominated for an Academy Award. It is 7 minutes long and it depicts Maggie Simpson, alone and without dialogue, navigating a daycare facility run with authoritarian efficiency, protecting a caterpillar from a bully, and ultimately succeeding in releasing a butterfly into the world by outmaneuvering every obstacle placed between her and that goal. In those 7 minutes, Maggie demonstrates cognitive abilities that would be remarkable in any person, let alone a 1-year-old. She reads the environment. She identifies the power dynamics of the facility and the individuals within it within moments of arriving. She assesses threat levels and assigns priority. She develops a plan to protect the caterpillar that accounts for multiple contingencies and requires accurate prediction of how other children and the facility's staff will respond to various actions. She improvises when her plan encounters obstacles. She executes the final sequence of her strategy with timing and spatial awareness that suggests a mind capable of modeling complex cause and effect chains in real time, all without saying a word, all while being physically limited to the motor capabilities of an infant. She falls, she stumbles, she cannot run effectively, but every decision she makes is correct, and when her body fails to execute what her mind has planned, she adjusts and finds another way. Her intelligence is so far ahead of her physical development that they seem to belong to different people. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence more than once. The results vary in their specifics depending on the episode, but the direction of the results is consistent. Maggie scores off the charts. The evaluators do not quite know what to do with the numbers. The family is told something vague and impressive, and then the moment passes, and everyone returns to treating her like a baby who cannot understand what is happening around her. But she understands what is happening around her. She always has. Consider the final shot of Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2. Everyone has left the room. Maggie has been identified as the shooter. The case has been closed, and the family is gathering to go home. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully, checking that she is not being observed. Then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The camera holds on her expression for a moment before cutting away. The show wants you to read this as confirmation. Maggie did it, and she knows she did it, and the private reenactment is a kind of secret acknowledgement of her guilt. But there is another reading. She watched someone shoot a man. She is a 1-year-old with an extraordinary memory and an extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition. She is replaying what she witnessed the way any child replays something that made a strong impression on them. She is not confessing. She is remembering. The distinction between those two readings is significant, and the show deliberately constructed the moment to support both. Now step back and look at the bigger picture of Maggie's strategic position within the Simpson family. Lisa is brilliant. This is established early and maintained consistently throughout the show's run. Lisa has an IQ that places her well above everyone in her household and the vast majority of adults in Springfield. She is one of the most intellectually gifted characters in the entire series. And what has Lisa's intelligence gotten her? Isolation, mockery, the specific loneliness of being the most capable person in a room that does not value capability. Lisa speaks and is ignored. Lisa challenges authority and is punished. Lisa tries to improve the world around her, and the world around her resists, sidesteps, and eventually exhausts her. Her intelligence is visible and worn externally, announced in every conversation, and the world that surrounds her responds to that visibility with consistent indifference or active resistance. Maggie has watched this happen her entire life. She has been present for every moment of Lisa's intellectual isolation, every time Lisa's insight was dismissed, every time her brilliance was treated as an inconvenience rather than an asset. Maggie has been watching and learning and processing, and what she has concluded from the available evidence is that visible intelligence in this household and this town is a liability. Lisa's strategy is to keep fighting regardless of the cost, to wave the flag of her own intelligence and refuse to lower it no matter how many times the world fails to salute it. This is admirable. It is also, based on the evidence, not working particularly well. Maggie's strategy is the opposite. Be invisible. Let them underestimate you. Let the adults around you treat you as passive and dependent while you observe everything and plan accordingly. Do your most important work in the margins, in the spaces where nobody is paying attention, because those are the only spaces where someone of unusual capability can operate without attracting the resistance that visibility brings. Think about how effectively this strategy has served her. She shot a man and was identified as the shooter, and the response was Chief Wiggum explaining that no jury would convict a baby. The very fact of her age and apparent helplessness shielded her from consequences that would have destroyed any adult in the same situation. Her disguise, the performance of helpless infancy, is more effective legal protection than most adults could construct. She organized and led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker and succeeded completely, and not one adult in the facility understood what had happened well enough to prevent it, because they had not been paying attention to the baby. Every time Maggie does something extraordinary, the people around her process it as anomaly, as coincidence, as an accident produced by the random movements of an infant who could not possibly have intended the outcome. The reality that she intended every outcome never enters anyone's mind. She has made the most valuable cognitive space in Springfield, the space that nobody watches. Now, connect this to the broader framework of Springfield's mysteries. If the radiation theory is correct, and Springfield's nuclear contamination produces different mutations in different residents, Maggie and Homer represent the two extreme poles of the same environmental exposure. Homer's mutation diminished his cognition to the point of clinical disability. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of exposure, all of it working in the direction of reduction. Maggie's mutation, same parents, same household, same water supply, went the other way. Her cognition was not diminished by the contamination. It was amplified, pushed beyond what should be biologically possible for her developmental stage, and paired with a physical form that provides perfect cover because it projects incapacity. She is what the radiation gives when it gives instead of takes. And there is a question the show has been building toward for 36 years without answering. What is Maggie waiting for? She has the intelligence, she has the strategic patience, she has the information, because she has been present for and attentive to every significant event in Springfield's recent history, while presenting herself as a passive observer who could not possibly be integrating what she witnesses. She has the will, demonstrated repeatedly in high-stakes situations where she has made clear choices with clear consequences. She is waiting for something. The show has never told us what. But behind that pacifier, behind those enormous watchful eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate silence, something is thinking very carefully about Springfield and about its own place within it, and about the right moment to stop pretending. Nobody knows what Maggie Simpson is going to do when she finally decides to act. That might be the most genuinely unsettling thing about her. Section 7, Level 7 Mr. Burns, and the Immortality Machine. Craziness rating, 7 out of 10. Charles Montgomery Burns is, depending on which episode you use for your reference point, somewhere between 100 and 140 years old. The show has never settled on a precise birth year. His age has been stated, implied, revised, and contradicted across dozens of episodes in ways that make pinning down a specific number impossible. But every version of his biographical timeline places his birth in the late 1800s, before the turn of the 20th century. He has described personal memories from that era with the specificity and casual authority of someone recounting lived experience rather than historical knowledge. He has referenced events from the early 1900s as things he participated in, not things he studied. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, in a capacity the show is deliberately vague about beyond suggesting his contribution to the Allied cause was morally complicated at best. He knew Howard Hughes personally. He has a $1 trillion bill, which he stole from the United States government during the war and kept hidden for decades, that he treats not as a historical artifact, but as a personal possession, the way you might treat something you grabbed from a drawer and forgot to return. He has described the Gilded Age, the period of extraordinary wealth, concentration, and unregulated industrial expansion that defined American life in the late 19th century, not as history but as lived context. As the water his family swam in. By any conservative calculation, Burns is operating well past the normal human lifespan. And not just surviving in a diminished, bedridden, requiring constant medical support way. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal politics with strategic sophistication. He orchestrates schemes that require sustained long-term planning, a working understanding of modern finance and law, and the cognitive capacity to execute complex multi-step agendas over extended periods. His body is frail and his physical strength is negligible, but his mind is razor-sharp and has been, for longer than any human mind should be capable of remaining that way. So how is he alive? The show addresses this directly in the Springfield Files episode, which is mostly remembered for a different reason but contains the most important exposition about Burns's biological maintenance that the show ever provides. In that episode, Homer encounters what he believes is an alien in the woods near Springfield. The FBI is called. The whole town becomes consumed by the mystery. The episode builds toward a dramatic reveal, and when the truth finally emerges, the alien is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns, it turns out, undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with chemicals and radiation, that it gives his body what the show describes as a healthy green glow. The treatment is the thing keeping him alive. Without it, he will die within 7 days. The margin is absolute. Miss a single treatment and the system collapses. His survival depends on this weekly intervention with the precision that a hospital patient on dialysis depends on their machine. And after each treatment, Burns exits the facility in a dazed, euphoric state, wandering through the woods near the plant in a way that makes him look, to anyone who happens to encounter him, like a creature from another world. He literally glows in the dark. His body emits visible light from the radiation saturation of the treatment. He stumbles between the trees with an alien grace, and Springfield residents who have glimpsed him in these post-treatment walks have been reporting extraterrestrial encounters ever since. The treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns the nuclear power plant, whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, is himself sustained by controlled radiation exposure. He has not merely profited from radiation, he is powered by it. His biology, altered over more than a century of proximity to nuclear material, can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. It requires external radiation input as regularly and as absolutely as a normal body requires food and water. Take the radiation away and the carefully maintained balance of Burns's biology collapses. Which brings us to the most famous medical diagnosis in the show's history. Burns visits a doctor, and the doctor delivers results that should be impossible. Burns, the doctor explains, has every disease known to medical science. Every single one. Simultaneously, his body is hosting an extraordinary variety of illnesses, any one of which would normally be fatal, all of them present at the same time. Cancer, various infections, degenerative conditions, parasitic invasions. All of them, all at once, in a single body that by rights should have been dead from any one of them decades ago. But Burns is not dead because the illnesses are in balance. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome, comparing it to three people all trying to walk through a doorway at the same time. None of them can get through. Burns's diseases are all attempting to kill him simultaneously. Because they are all present at once, competing for the same cellular real estate, they create a biological gridlock that prevents any single illness from gaining the dominance it would need to actually kill him. Each disease blocks every other disease, and in the resulting stalemate, Burns continues to exist. The show plays this for laughs. It is one of the most quoted medical scenes in the series. But if you accept the radiation theory, the scene stops being funny and starts being the most precise description of Burns's biological situation that the show ever provides. His diseases are not in natural equilibrium. Nothing about his condition is natural at this point. The weekly radiation treatments are maintaining the stalemate. They are not curing his illnesses. They are managing them, keeping every pathology in a state of controlled suspension, preventing any single condition from gaining the momentum it needs to break through the biological gridlock and kill him. Remove the treatments and the equilibrium dissolves. The gridlock breaks. Everything surges forward at once, and Burns experiences the accumulated consequences of over a century of failing to die properly. Burns is not surviving. He is being maintained. The distinction matters because maintenance requires infrastructure. It requires the machinery of wealth that Burns has spent a century building. Every dollar he has ever earned, every institution he has ever corrupted, every politician he has purchased, every doctor he has retained, it all serves, at its most fundamental level, the same single purpose: keep the treatments coming. His empire is not primarily a business enterprise in the conventional sense. It is a life support system. The nuclear power plant provides the radiation source for his weekly treatments. The financial empire provides the resources to maintain the medical infrastructure that keeps him alive. The political influence he purchases ensures that no regulatory authority will ever effectively challenge the operations that supply his life support. Every component of Burns's power structure feeds back into his survival. And Smithers. Waylon Smithers, Burns's endlessly devoted personal assistant, is usually discussed in terms of his emotional attachment to his employer, the unrequited nature of his devotion, the pathos of his position. But there is a reading of Smithers that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with function. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Every appointment, every commitment, every medical visit, Burns's weekly treatments require precise scheduling. They cannot be missed. They cannot be delayed by more than a specific window of time without catastrophic consequences. In a body as fragile and as precisely maintained as Burns's, the difference between treatment and no treatment is a week, not months, not years, a week. Someone has to ensure that Burns makes every appointment. Someone has to understand the medical protocol well enough to recognize when something has gone wrong and act accordingly. Someone has to manage the logistics of keeping a 140-year-old man alive through artificial means on a weekly schedule with zero tolerance for error. That someone is Smithers. His devotion to Burns is not purely emotional. It is functional. Smithers knows that his presence, his vigilance, his organizational competence is what stands between Burns and the collapse of every biological system that has been artificially sustained for over a century. If Smithers leaves, or is removed, or becomes unable to manage Burns's schedule, Burns misses a treatment, Burns dies. The empire collapses. Smithers is not just devoted to Burns. Smithers is keeping Burns alive, and Smithers knows it. And that knowledge, the understanding that his continued presence is a matter of literal life and death for the person he has organized his life around, is the deepest foundation of their relationship. The emotional devotion sits on top of a more basic functional dependency. Burns needs Smithers to remain alive. Smithers's commitment is not just personal, it is biological. The question of Burns's age raises a further question that the show gestures toward without ever fully developing. Is Burns unique in his longevity, or does his family have a history of this? The Burns dynasty, as the show depicts it, is one of the oldest and most continuously powerful lineages in American history. They were wealthy before the Industrial Revolution. They built infrastructure and charged everyone else to use it. They have maintained their position at the top of the economic hierarchy through every era of American history, every financial disruption, every political upheaval, with a consistency that suggests something beyond ordinary generational wealth. Before nuclear radiation, before the specific medical technology that currently keeps Burns alive, before any of the modern infrastructure that sustains his biology, what were the earlier Burns patriarchs using to extend their grip on power? How did a family maintain continuous control of its fortune for centuries without the kind of turnover that normally happens when wealthy families age, die, and have their estates distributed? The show does not answer this. It does not even directly ask it, but it establishes, through Burns's historical memories and the implied age of the family fortune, that something unusual has been happening in the Burns bloodline for a very long time. Burns is not immortal. He is something more precise and more disturbing than immortal. He is too expensive to die. His survival is not miraculous. It is manufactured, maintained at extraordinary cost by an infrastructure specifically designed for that purpose. And as long as that infrastructure holds, as long as the treatments come, and Smithers manages the schedule, and the empire funds the medicine, and the medicine keeps the diseases balanced, and the balance keeps Burns functional, he will continue to exist. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot function without him. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant's continued operation depends on Burns. Burns's continued operation depends on the treatments. The treatments depend on the resources that Burns's empire provides. It is a closed-loop, self-sustaining, circular, and the only way out of it is a disruption large enough to break every link in the chain simultaneously. And in Springfield, that kind of disruption never comes. Springfield resets after every catastrophe. The town always returns to the configuration it was in before. The power plant keeps running, the water stays contaminated. Burns keeps receiving his treatments. And the oldest man in America, glowing faintly from his weekly maintenance, keeps signing Homer's paycheck and forgetting Homer's name and living his impossible, expensive, engineered existence at the top of a hierarchy he built to sustain itself forever. Section 8. Level 8. Mona Simpson and the Three-Generation Conspiracy. Craziness rating. 7.5 out of 10. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story, told to Homer by his father Abe, reinforced by a gravestone. Abe showed him, never questioned by anyone because Homer had no reason to question it. His mother had died when he was young. That was the fact of his life. That was the wound he carried without knowing it was a wound, the absence that shaped everything about how he moved through the world, without anyone ever explaining to him what the shape had been built around. Homer's neediness, his desperate hunger for approval, his clinginess with Marge, his terror of abandonment, the panic that surfaces whenever he perceives that his family might leave him, his inability to leave a bad job, his willingness to absorb humiliation and degradation from his employer rather than risk losing the stability of his position, his compulsive need to be liked by everyone who crosses his path, even people who have demonstrated clearly that they do not like him and never will. All of it, every anxious, needy, clinging corner of Homer Simpson's psychology, traces back to the formative belief that he was a boy whose mother had chosen to die rather than stay with him. That, whatever he was, whatever he had to offer, was not enough to make someone who loved him want to remain. That the world would leave him if he was not careful, and that the only way to prevent it was to make himself so agreeable, so useful, so perpetually present that leaving would become harder than staying. Homer built his entire personality around a lie. In Season 7, in an episode widely considered one of the greatest the show has ever produced, the lie was dismantled. Homer's mother was alive. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November of 1995. Here is what happened. Homer, attempting to avoid a Saturday work obligation by faking his death, pushed a dummy off a cliff near the power plant and allowed the town to believe he had died. When Marge insisted he go to the Hall of Records to correct the error, Homer found something in the municipal records that should not have been possible. His mother was listed as living. She had never died. The grave Abe had shown him did not belong to her. It belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. For Homer's entire life, his father had been passing off a famous writer's headstone as his wife's burial site. Homer found his mother at a cemetery, visiting what she believed was her son's grave. They did not recognize each other at first, because the last time they had seen each other, he was very young. But when Homer proved who he was, the reunion that followed was one of the most emotionally honest scenes the show ever produced. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other next to a headstone that belonged to neither of them. And then Mona told him the truth. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She did not leave because there was something wrong with him or something she could not face about the future they might have had together. She left because a man had seen her face and reported her to the FBI, and staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. The man who saw her face was Mr. Burns. Here is the history that the show needed several seasons before it could tell. In 1969, Mona Simpson was an ordinary housewife, married to Abe, mother of young Homer, living a quiet life in Springfield while the world outside burned through the civil rights movement and the counterculture and the protests against Vietnam. Then something changed. She was radicalized gradually by what she saw happening in the world around her, and she joined a group of activists who had identified a specific target: a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Burns, at this point in Springfield's history, was not merely running a nuclear power plant. He owned a facility designed to produce weapons-grade biological agents, a germ warfare laboratory, in the same town where he had later built a nuclear reactor. In the same community where Homer was growing up, where children were playing in parks and families were drinking from the same water supply, Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored inside. During the chaos of the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be a young Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid succeeded. The weapons were destroyed, but Mona made a mistake. As the group fled, she stopped. Someone had been knocked down in the confusion. She stopped to help them. That someone was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. And Burns looked up from the ground and saw her face and recognized it in the specific way that powerful men who have been wronged by someone tend to recognize the people who wronged them. He reported her to the FBI. From that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was disappearing. She kissed him while he was sleeping and walked out into the night, and Homer woke up to an absence that his father told him was a death. For 27 years, Burns did not stop at reporting her. He pursued her. He held the grudge that powerful men hold when someone has taken something from them. the special cold fury of someone who is accustomed to being untouchable, encountering a moment where they were not. When Mona returned to Springfield in season 7, Burns recognized her almost immediately. He spotted her through a cab window and called the authorities. The FBI arrived at the Simpson house. Mona had to run again. Homer had to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. And this time, Homer knew why she was leaving. He knew who was responsible. The man responsible was his employer. The man whose name Homer cannot remember, though Homer has worked for him his entire adult life, is the man who destroyed Homer's family, who drove his mother underground when Homer was 6 years old, who ensured that Homer grew up believing himself to be the kind of person a mother would rather fake her own death than raise. Homer works for Burns. He cashes Burns's checks. He spends his days in the facility that funds Burns's empire and maintains Burns's survival and generates the economic weight that has allowed Burns to pursue Mona Simpson across decades and across jurisdictions. And Homer does not connect these things. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not even seem to fully process the relationship between the man who signs his paycheck and the man who stole his childhood. The show does not frame this as a joke. It frames it as tragedy. Homer's inability to connect what he knows about Burns, the employer, and what he knows about Burns, the man who destroyed his family, is not played for comedy. It is played as the portrait of someone whose cognitive capacity for that kind of synthesis was taken from him long before he ever had the chance to use it. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of living in Springfield's contaminated environment. Homer is too damaged to understand the architecture of his own suffering. Now the conspiracy deepens. In a later season, the show reveals that Burns and Grandpa Simpson, Abe, struck a deal. Burns had committed a crime, and Abe discovered it. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a permanent position at the nuclear power plant. No matter how many mistakes Homer made, no matter how many safety violations he caused, no matter how many times he should have been fired for incompetence or negligence, he would keep his job. The deal was not about Homer's welfare. It was about burying something Abe knew that Burns needed, kept quiet. Homer's job security, which always seemed like a cartoon convenience for storytelling purposes, was actually a contractual obligation between his father and his mother's persecutor, brokered in secret, never explained to Homer because explaining it would require explaining everything else. Burns drove Mona out of Springfield. Abe made a deal with the person who destroyed his family to protect a secret about that same person. And Homer spent his entire adult life working for the man responsible for all of it, protected by a deal he never knew existed, unable to see the pattern even when every element of it was visible. 3 generations of Simpsons, all shaped by one man's grudge against a woman who stopped to help him off the ground. And here is the final piece of this that deserves attention. The show proved, in the episode where Homer's crayon was temporarily removed and his IQ rose dramatically, that Homer is capable of intelligence. That the brilliant, articulate, strategically capable version of Homer exists and is accessible if the obstacles are removed. The man Homer could have been is not a fantasy. He is literally in there, waiting behind a physical obstruction and a lifetime of radiation damage and the accumulated weight of a childhood shaped by maternal absence. That man, the capable version of Homer, would have seen the connection between Burns the employer and Burns the destroyer of his family. That man would have had the cognitive tools to trace the architecture of his own situation and understand it. That man would have had options. Burns did not just take Homer's mother. He took Homer's potential, not through any single deliberate act directed at Homer personally, at least not initially. He took it by driving Mona away when Homer was 6, ensuring that Homer grew up emotionally damaged and desperate for approval, and then by keeping Homer employed in conditions that guaranteed continued cognitive erosion, and then by maintaining the system that prevented any meaningful challenge to the arrangement. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The scene is quiet and devastating in a way that the show rarely permits itself. Homer sits beside her and holds her hand and watches her go. No joke softens the moment. No cutaway gag provides relief, just a man and his mother, and the weight of 27 years stolen, and another handful recovered, and then lost again. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has been a comedy for 36 years. But underneath the comedy, underneath the slapstick and the celebrity cameos and the elaborate visual gags, there is a story about a family that was systematically broken by one man's power and one town's inability to resist it. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the person who broke his family and buried the truth. Homer inherited the consequences and spent his life unable to understand why everything felt so heavy. Burns won. Burns, in the Springfield of the show's universe, always wins, because he built a system designed to ensure that outcome. And Homer is still at the power plant, still signing in each morning, still forgetting his badge, still somehow surviving. Section 9. Level 9. The Springfield Nuclear Mutation Theory. Craziness rating, 8.5 out of 10. Here is a question that The Simpsons has been asking you for 36 years without framing it as a question. Why are the people of Springfield yellow? Not the cartoon characters broadly, not animation in general, Springfield specifically. The residents of Springfield have a distinctive jaundiced coloration that is not shared by every animated character or even every character in the Simpsons universe. When guest characters visit Springfield from outside the town, they look different. Their proportions are more natural, their eyes sit more normally in their faces, their features more closely resemble human anatomy as it actually exists. Outsiders in Springfield look relatively normal. The residents of Springfield look like the residents of Springfield. The show has a ready answer for this. It is the art style. It is how The Simpsons looks. Every character is drawn this way because that is the visual language of the show. That is the production answer. It is accurate from a technical standpoint, but it does not explain the differential. If it were purely a stylistic choice, it would apply to everyone equally. The fact that visiting characters from outside Springfield are consistently drawn with more realistic proportions, while Springfield residents maintain their distinctive appearance, suggests that within the logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable difference between people who live in Springfield and people who don't. The people inside the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look normal. This is where the nuclear mutation theory begins, and it builds from there into something that eventually touches almost every strange thing about Springfield and the people who live in it. Start with what the show explicitly establishes about the Springfield nuclear power plant. It is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility, owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns. It provides the primary electrical power for the entire town, and it is, by any measure that could be applied to real facilities, catastrophically dangerous. A surprise inspection found 342 violations. The cost to bring the plant into compliance was estimated at $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. The violations are not minor administrative oversights. They are fundamental safety failures of a kind that should produce immediate emergency shutdowns. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water accessible to the public. Radioactive waste being left on children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight. Cooling towers with structural failures patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats moving through the facility's interior spaces. And one that the show drops and then moves on from without acknowledging its implications. Human skeletons in the basement. Actual human remains in the basement of an operating nuclear power plant. The inspection found them and reported them, and then the show never explained who those people were, how they came to be there, or what had happened to them inside a facility where Burns had demonstrated complete indifference to the safety of everyone within it. Standing between all of this and catastrophic consequences to the surrounding population is Homer Simpson, whose role as nuclear safety inspector and whose IQ the show's own creator has said is 55. A man who sleeps at his workstation. Who eats donuts during meltdown warnings? Who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core because he wanted to see if the radiation would make it larger? This facility, run this way, has been operating in the middle of Springfield for the entirety of the show's run. The first visible evidence of what it is doing to the town appears in Season 2. A fisherman pulls from a river near the power plant a 3-eyed fish, which the show names Blinky. Blinky is not a subtle symbol. Blinky is the show drawing you a diagram and labeling it clearly. A fish with a radiation-induced mutation pulled from a body of water that receives runoff from the most negligently operated nuclear facility in the history of fiction in a town that drinks from the same water supply. Blinky becomes a political cause. A gubernatorial candidate uses it as evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate its harmlessness. The town watches Burns eat the 3-eyed fish and then moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody follows up. Nobody asks the obvious question about what the fish's mutation indicates about the fish's environment and what that environment is doing to the people who drink from it. In the Simpsons movie, the evidence becomes impossible to contextualize as anything other than what it is. Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so severe that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal regulatory agency operating within the show's universe, determines that the town must be physically sealed under a glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. The United States government, within the logic of the show's world, assessed Springfield and concluded that the entire town was so toxic, so dangerous, so fundamentally contaminated, that physical containment was the only viable response. Springfield is not just polluted. Springfield is, officially and formally, an environmental hazard classified by federal authority. Every person in town was inside the dome when it went up. Now, look at the residents themselves, carefully, through the lens of what the plant has been doing to their water and their air. Homer Simpson. Massive overbite. Eyes that sit too prominently in his face. 4 fingers on each hand. A skull shape that does not correspond to normal human anatomy. An IQ so low it constitutes a clinical disability. A body that absorbs physical trauma with a resilience that should be impossible. He has been shot, electrocuted, fallen off multiple cliffs, been struck by cars, survived explosions, and recovered from every one of these events with a speed and completeness that defies what should be possible for a human body. His healing rate is not just enhanced, it is superhuman in the most literal sense. He has worked in direct proximity to an active reactor core for his entire adult life. Marge Simpson. Same prominent eyes, same 4 fingers. Hair that defies the laws of physics, growing vertically in a tower that she has maintained at the same height and shape for 36 years without apparent effort or artificial support. Bart, Lisa, Maggie. All born in Springfield. All raised on Springfield's water supply. All breathing Springfield's air. All displaying the physical characteristics that the show treats as simply how these people look. The spiky hair that holds its shape without product. The overbites. The eyes. The yellow skin that covers every resident of this town and, critically, no one else. No character who visits Springfield from outside shares these characteristics. Only the people who live in the contamination zone look this way. Burns knows this. The show makes this explicit across multiple episodes, and it becomes most clear when you put the relevant pieces together. Burns undergoes weekly radiation treatments that his personal physicians manage. He funds private medical research. He has an entire pharmaceutical infrastructure at his disposal. He has, through decades of managing his own radiation-dependent biology, developed a more sophisticated understanding of what radiation does to biological systems than anyone else in Springfield. He knows what his plant is doing to the town. He has always known. And he has made a calculation. The cost of fixing the violations is $56 million. The value of the operational power plant, the revenue it generates, the monopoly it maintains over Springfield's electricity supply, the economic control it gives him over the town's population, vastly exceeds that cost. More importantly, fixing the violations would require admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would invite the regulatory scrutiny that would reveal what those violations had already done to the people living downwind. Burns is not negligent, he is strategic. The German investors who briefly purchased the plant, the one time the facility changed hands during the show's run, provide the clearest evidence of this. The first thing they did upon acquiring the plant was fire Homer. The second thing they did was commission an honest assessment of the cost of bringing the facility into compliance. The estimate nearly destroyed the company. Burns bought the plant back immediately and rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down within a week. Homer is the guarantee that the plant stays open. His presence in the safety role is not an accident of incompetence. It is infrastructure. Homer ensures the violations continue. The violations ensure the contamination continues. The contamination continues to poison the water and the air and the cognitive function of the population living downwind. And a population with compromised cognitive function is less likely to figure out what is being done to them. The crayon episode makes this point in the darkest way possible. Homer, with the crayon temporarily removed, becomes suddenly and dramatically more intelligent. He sees Springfield for what it is. He sees his job for what it is. He understands the architecture of his situation with a clarity that he has never previously been capable of, and he chooses to put the crayon back in. He chooses to return to cognitive impairment, because the intelligent version of his life was unbearable, because seeing Springfield clearly, understanding what it actually was, understanding what had been done to him and his family, was worse than not knowing. He chose the fog. But here is what the show does not say directly, what it leaves for you to assemble yourself from the pieces it has provided. How did a crayon get lodged in a child's brain in the first place, without anyone detecting it? Homer went through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life, visiting doctors in Springfield, receiving medical care from Springfield's healthcare providers. Not a single one of them found a foreign object in his skull. Either every doctor in Springfield is so incompetent that they missed a crayon lodged in a patient's brain for decades, or the medical establishment in Springfield is not fully independent of the power structure that runs the town. If Burns's influence extends into the healthcare system the way it extends into the economy and the regulatory infrastructure, then the doctors of Springfield might know things they have chosen, or been pressured, or been paid not to act on. Homer's crayon is not just an absurdist detail about a man whose brain contains office supplies. It is the show's metaphor for the specific way that Springfield's population has been kept manageable. Something is wrong with the brains of Springfield's residents. Something that keeps them functioning, keeps them showing up to work and raising their children and filling the pews on Sunday and maintaining the social contract, while preventing them from asking the questions that would unsettle everything. The radiation from the plant does not just mutate physical characteristics, it affects cognition. It damages the critical thinking functions that would otherwise allow the population to look up at the cracked cooling towers and connect them to the three-eyed fish and the yellow skin and the impossible injury recovery rates and the babies with off-charts intelligence and ask the question that should have been asked 30 years ago. Why are we all like this? The answer has been in the skyline the entire time. Every yellow face in Springfield, every bulging eye, every four-fingered hand, every impossible recovery from fatal injury, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset, every time the town moves on from something that should have broken it permanently, all of it traces back to the cracked cooling towers and the leaking reactor and the 342 violations and the man who refused to spend $56 million to fix them because fixing them would mean admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would mean answering for what they had already done. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not background scenery. It is not a setting detail. It is the mechanism through which every other mystery in this show is made possible and sustained. It is not part of the show. It is the show. Section 10. Level 10. Homer's coma and the dream that never ended. Craziness rating? 9.5 out of 10. We have arrived at the deepest point of Springfield. This theory is the one that changes things. The one that, once you have considered it seriously, makes it difficult to watch the show the same way afterward. Not because it is depressing, though it has that quality, because it is the one that makes the most sense. The one that explains, with an elegance that no other framework matches, everything that is strange about Springfield and everything that has become progressively stranger over the show's run. Let us go back to April 1993. The 18th episode of Season 4 aired on the 1st of April 1993. The title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was structured around Bart's escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer, which reached their climax when Bart took one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placed it inside an industrial paint shaker. Homer opened the can. The resulting explosion sent him to the hospital. While Homer was lying in his hospital bed, he noticed a vending machine across the room. He wanted a candy bar. He got up, reached for the machine, and the machine tipped over and fell on him. Homer flatlined and entered a coma. The episode made this clear. This was not a cutaway gag or a comedic exaggeration. Homer was in a real coma. He was clinically unconscious for 7 weeks. His family sat by his bedside. The town mourned. Bart, racked with guilt over his role in the accident, confessed tearfully at Homer's bedside. And then Homer woke up, grabbed Bart's throat. The family laughed. Everything went back to normal. The show told you he woke up, but in the final moments of the same episode, the show also told you something else. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma, 5% gone, destroyed, never coming back. Permanent neurological damage from the injury and the period of unconsciousness. Homer's response to learning he was permanently brain damaged was to laugh. He said he did not know why he was laughing. The family found this endearing. The episode ended, and 32 more seasons followed as if nothing had happened. Unless nothing did happen. Unless Homer never woke up at all. This is the Homer coma theory. It is the most debated, most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons, and the evidence that supports it is not speculative. It is structural. It is built into the architecture of the show itself. The basic argument is this. Homer Simpson did not regain consciousness in April of 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every guest appearance, every plot that strains the boundaries of narrative possibility is a dream. The product of a comatose, slowly dying brain lying in a hospital bed in Springfield generating an imaginary continuation of a life that ended when a vending machine fell on a middle-aged man who only wanted a candy bar. Start with the tonal shift, because it is the most visible and the most discussed piece of evidence. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic in a strict sense, because it was always a cartoon, but the storylines dealt with recognizable human experiences rendered through satire. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers an emotional affair with her bowling instructor. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher who sees her potential and then leaves. Bart struggles academically and faces being held back. These are domestic problems scaled to the everyday. Financial pressure, marital tension, academic failure, the emotional architecture of a real middle-class family in a specific American moment. After the coma, everything changed. The change was not gradual. It was seismic. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers his mother has been a fugitive radical for decades. Homer meets God, twice. Homer goes to Japan, Australia, Brazil, England, and dozens of other countries. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs. Homer befriends celebrities, fights bodyguards, runs a grease company, becomes a hip-hop manager, joins a barbershop quartet, runs for sanitation commissioner, becomes a food critic, learns to play the guitar, gets ordained as a minister, and survives more near-death experiences than an action movie franchise. The escalation is so dramatic and so consistent in its direction, always moving further from the ordinary and closer to the fantastical, that it cannot be coincidental. The Simpsons did not simply get more surreal with age the way many long-running comedies do. It got surreal on a specific schedule, after a specific event, and kept getting more surreal in direct proportion to how much time passed from that event. The coma theory argues that the escalation has an explanation. Homer's brain is getting worse. As the years pass, as the brain damage from the coma deepens, as the neural tissue continues to degrade in the absence of consciousness, the dream becomes less coherent, less anchored to the observable logic of the real world, more subject to the dream logic that fills in for coherence when the mind can no longer maintain it. The dream started relatively stable in the period immediately after the coma, when the brain was still relatively intact. It has become progressively more unreal as the damage has progressed. The show did not get bad. Homer's brain got worse. Now here is the detail that makes the theory haunt you in a specific way. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer had a conversation with God. A real, canonical, face-to-face conversation with the actual divine being. The Simpsons established early that God exists within the show's universe, and in that premiere episode, God and Homer talked directly, with God telling Homer that Homer would learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God told Homer his time was coming. 6 months later, Homer was in a coma. God told Homer that his time was almost up, and 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ended. What the show presented as a theological gag, a quirky sitcom beat about a lazy man's unconventional relationship with faith, reads under the coma theory as a prophecy. God was preparing Homer, giving him advance warning, in the only language that Homer's mind could receive without causing him distress, that his waking life was approaching its end. And everything that followed was Homer's mind refusing to accept that end. The aging problem is where the theory becomes most elegant. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not changed. The show uses a floating timeline that keeps the present always contemporary while the characters remain locked at the same ages forever. Every other theory that attempts to explain this requires some mechanism, some biological process or supernatural intervention or collective social agreement to account for why time appears not to pass. The coma theory has a much simpler answer. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and never woke up. His children do not age because he was not there to watch them grow. His unconscious brain cannot imagine Bart at 15 or 20 or 30 because he never experienced Bart at those ages. The dream can only generate what Homer already knew. The Bart in Homer's coma is the Bart Homer last saw before the vending machine fell. The Lisa in the dream is 8 because 8 is the last age Homer was present for. The Maggie in the dream is 1 because 1 was the last age Maggie reached while Homer was still awake to witness it. They are not frozen by radiation or magic or collective denial. They are frozen because they are memory. Because a dreaming brain can only reproduce what it already holds, and what Homer holds, the last intact image he has of his family before the darkness came, is the family as they existed in the spring of 1993. The celebrity appearances in later seasons make complete sense under this reading. Homer's coma brain, lying in a hospital bed in a world that continues to happen around it, is receiving environmental stimuli. Sounds from the television in his room, voices of visitors speaking to each other at his bedside, music from somewhere down the corridor. The brain processes these fragments of the external world, strips them of context, and incorporates them into the dream as characters. That is why later seasons are flooded with celebrity guest appearances in a way the earlier seasons were not. The longer Homer is unconscious, the more external media his brain has absorbed. The celebrities who appear in Springfield are not famous people who happen to visit a small American town. They are voices Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness, translated into dream characters by a mind that needed to fill its world with familiar faces. The show acknowledged this theory directly. In a season 34 episode, the writers created what appeared to be a deleted scene in which Homer woke from a long coma and revealed that everything, every outlandish episode, had been a dream. The scene was described as having been leaked by hackers. The show's official response was to deny it, to say the scene was a fake, a deliberate piece of misdirection, something planted by outside parties. But the scene was animated. The show's own production resources were used to create it. The writers produced a scene depicting the exact premise of the coma theory and then denied it was real. They showed you the answer and told you it was someone else's joke. Al Jean, the executive producer, addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it was not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation, but he did not explain why nobody ages. He did not address the tonal shift after season 4. He did not account for God's prophecy in the season 4 premiere. He did not explain the progressive surrealism that tracks precisely with the timeline the coma theory predicts. He said it was not true, and the interviewer moved on. That is the entire official rebuttal. The fans did not move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever done. It makes the show make sense. All of it. The aging freeze and the tonal shift and the celebrity flood and the impossible physical survivals and the reset button that erases consequences between episodes and the fact that Homer can endure anything because his body is not the thing enduring it. His body is lying in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind cannot be permanently harmed by anything that happens in the dream. And here is the part that stays with you. If the coma theory is true, if Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, then what he has been dreaming is not an adventure. It is not escapism. It is not wish fulfillment in the conventional sense. It is his family. That is what the dream contains. That is what his dying brain has been generating for 3 decades. Not wealth, not power, not a different life, or a better life, or an exciting life. His family. Marge still loving him. Bart still being his mischievous 10-year-old who needs to be strangled gently. Lisa still playing her saxophone in her room on Saturday mornings. Maggie still small enough to hold in a way that she was already almost past by the time the vending machine fell. Homer's deepest wish is so simple it is almost unbearable. He wants to go home to Evergreen Terrace. He wants it to still be the same house with the same people in it. He wants Friday night to still be Friday night, with the television and the beer and the family assembled on the couch. And in the dream, it is. The dream gives him everything. His children never grow up, so he never has to watch them leave. His wife never ages, so he never has to grieve the passing of youth in her face. His house never changes, so the specific texture of home, that precise combination of smells and sounds and spatial relationships that constitutes what home actually means, never disappears. The coma is not a nightmare. It is the only heaven that Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always young and the beer is always cold and nobody ever has to say goodbye. The dream refuses to end because Homer refuses to let it end. Every time Homer survives something that should kill him, every time the story resets after a catastrophe, every time the credits roll and Springfield is intact again, ready to begin another episode, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story conclude. Because if the story concludes, the dream stops. The simulation crashes. And Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed. How old his children really are now. Whether Marge waited beside his hospital bed, or whether she eventually had to acknowledge the reality of his condition and build whatever life she could from its wreckage. Whether anyone is still sitting beside him. Or whether, in the worst version of this, waking up is not possible anymore, and Homer's mind generates one more episode, one more reset, one more Sunday night on Evergreen Terrace, because that is all it knows how to do now. That is the coma theory. And the show will never confirm it. It will never disprove it either, because the evidence is not in any single episode or any writer's room statement. It is in the structure. It is in the fact that nobody ages, and the dreams keep getting stranger, and Homer always finds his way home, because in the dream, he never left. Section 11. The floating timeline where every theory converges. Craziness rating, 10 out of 10. We have covered a great deal of ground. We have walked through the geographic impossibility of a town that cannot be located on any map. We have traced the prediction phenomenon through confirmation bias and cultural influence, and the occasional coincidence that defies easy explanation. We have reopened the most famous unsolved mystery in animation history and found the official verdict considerably less settled than the show wants it to appear. We have sat with Ned Flanders' conditioned kindness and Hans Moleman's impossible longevity and Maggie's deliberate silence. We have followed the machinery of Burns' immortality. We have traced the three-generation conspiracy that runs from Mona Simpson through Abe Simpson to Homer, with Burns pulling the threads throughout. We have examined the nuclear contamination theory in its full disturbing scope. And now we arrive at the mystery that sits at the center of all of them. The one that every other theory eventually leads back to. The question that the show has been building towards since 1989 without ever framing it as a question: why doesn't anyone age? This is the floating timeline. The concept is straightforward in production terms. The show's present is always the viewer's present. When the episode airs in 1995, the characters are living in 1995. When it airs in 2025, they are living in 2025. The year updates around them. The technology in their world advances to match the current moment. The cultural references stay contemporary, but the characters themselves remain exactly as they were when the show began, frozen at their 1,989 ages, unchanged in any direction. Bart is 10, has been 10 for 36 years, will presumably be 10 for as long as the show continues to air. Lisa is 8, Maggie is 1. Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s, a fact that requires increasing creative gymnastics in the flashback episodes that attempt to show how they met and fell in love, because if they are in their mid-30s in 2025, then their high school years were in the 2000s, which means the show has to rewrite their backstory every few years to maintain the illusion of contemporary relatability while preserving the fiction that they have not aged. Homer and Marge's origin story has been told at least 4 times in the show's history. Each version places their formative years in a different decade. They were teenagers in the 1970s in the early backstory episodes, then in the 1980s, then the 1990s, then the 2000s. Their memories are not memories so much as drafts, revised continuously to fit whatever year the show is currently airing, without any of the characters or any other element of the show acknowledging that the version they are currently telling contradicts every version that came before. Characters in Springfield do not have fixed pasts. They have approximate pasts. Whatever backstory is needed for the current episode to function is the backstory that exists, and when the next episode needs something different, the old version is discarded without ceremony or acknowledgement. This is the floating timeline doing its work. It is not a bug in the show's continuity management. It is the show functioning exactly as designed. But step back from the production logic for a moment and look at what the floating timeline actually produces within the world of the show, and something much stranger comes into focus. 36 years have passed in the world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The characters of The Simpsons have existed in a permanent present tense, locked at specific ages, while everything around them advanced through 3.5 decades of cultural, political, economic, and technological change. They have contemporary smartphones. They reference current events. They exist in the current moment, but they have not aged into it. They have been carried along by the current of time without being changed by it. What does it feel like to exist like that? What would it mean? From the inside, the show imagines the answer across multiple episodes. It has depicted possible futures for these characters in flash-forward episodes and speculative storylines. In Lisa's Wedding, a Season 6 episode, the show jumped forward approximately 15 years and showed Lisa as a young adult woman engaged to an Englishman, navigating the complications of bringing an international partner into her particular American family. The episode was emotionally rich and precise in a way that suggested the writers understood exactly who Lisa would become given enough time. Intelligent, driven, slightly lonely, perpetually searching for the connection that the world she grew up in never quite provided. The episode proved that the show could imagine its characters aging. It had the capability. The writers could construct futures for these people that felt earned and true to who they were. But after the episode, Lisa was 8 again. The future closed like a window. The show chose not to let it stay open. Every theory we have explored arrives at the floating timeline eventually, and arrives at it from a different direction, which is what makes it the genuine center of the show's mystery structure. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. His sleeping brain cannot imagine them growing up because he was not there to witness it. The dream preserves his family at the last moment he experienced them. The last morning in 1993, when everything was normal and everyone was the age they were supposed to be. The radiation theory says nobody ages because their biology has been so fundamentally altered by decades of nuclear contamination that normal cellular aging processes have been disrupted. The same radiation that mutated their physical characteristics and compromised their cognitive function has also interfered with the biological mechanisms that normally drive aging. They are not unchanging by choice or by cartoon convention. They are unchanging because the environment has broken the machinery of time in their cells. The Principal and the Pauper theory, the episode where Springfield voted to maintain a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth and made honesty literally illegal, says nobody ages because the town collectively refuses to acknowledge that time is passing. Springfield maintains its impossible stasis through social contract, through the unspoken agreement that everyone will treat the current version of reality as the permanent one, and nobody will be allowed to notice or mention the accumulating contradictions. The characters do not age because acknowledging that they have aged would require acknowledging that time is passing, and acknowledging that time is passing would require acknowledging everything that time has brought with it. The contamination and the lies and the corruption and the accumulated weight of 3.5 decades of consequences that the reset button keeps pretending have not occurred. The Burns immortality theory says at least one person in Springfield has successfully negotiated with time through the application of sufficient wealth and medical technology, which means the concept of aging is already negotiable in this universe. If one resident of Springfield has found a way to exist outside the normal operation of biological time, what prevents the others from being caught in a version of the same disruption? Less intentional than Burns's engineered immortality, but no less real in its effects? All of these theories are describing the same thing from different angles. Time does not work in Springfield. Something, whether it is the radiation or the coma or the collective denial or the billionaire's technology, or all of these things operating in concert has broken the normal flow of cause and effect in this town. The characters are trapped in a loop, cycling through variations of the same situations, the same relationships, the same conflicts and resolutions and resets, without ever arriving at the destination that time should eventually deliver to every living thing. They cannot grow old, they cannot grow up, they cannot leave, they cannot change in any direction that sticks. The loop is their existence. And here is where the floating timeline becomes something larger than a production decision or a narrative device or a symptom of Springfield's specific dysfunction. Because the floating timeline is not just the show's relationship with time, it is the audience's relationship with the show. We have been watching these characters for 36 years. Many of the people watching now were born after the show premiered. The parents of some current viewers watched the same episodes in their own childhoods. Bart has been 10, while 3 generations of viewers have grown up around him. Lisa has been 8, while her audience moved through 8 and into adulthood and middle age and beyond. The characters cannot age, but we can. And we have. The show measures time for its audience in a way it cannot measure time for its characters. When you watch an episode of The Simpsons now that you first watched as a child, you are watching 2 things simultaneously. You are watching the episode. You are also watching the distance between who you were when you first saw it and who you are now. The show functions as a kind of temporal mirror, reflecting your own aging back at you through characters who cannot age themselves. The floating timeline is not just keeping Springfield frozen. It is holding a specific version of your past in suspended animation, accessible whenever you want it, unchanging, permanently available. The couch gag plays, and you are sitting on your childhood couch again for a few seconds, whatever age you were when you first heard that opening music, before the episode begins and the present reasserts itself. That is what the floating timeline actually is. It is a preservation technology, not for the characters. For us, Springfield is frozen because we need it to be frozen, because we are not ready to watch these characters age, and we will probably never be ready. Because Bart growing up means our own childhoods are over in a way that Bart staying 10 does not. Because Homer getting old means our fathers are getting old. Because Marge's hair going gray means something that we have been putting off acknowledging. The show is not refusing to let the characters age. We are. The show has been offering us the aging, in flash-forward episodes and speculative futures and moments where the possibility opens briefly and then closes again. Every time the possibility has opened, the audience has responded with a specific kind of discomfort that the show has been trained over decades to recognize as a signal to close the window. We pressed pause in 1989. We have never been able to bring ourselves to press play. And Springfield, responsive and accommodating and perfectly calibrated after 36 years to give its audience what they need, has maintained the pause for as long as we have needed it. The floating timeline is the show's thesis. Everything else we have explored is a footnote to this. The characters do not age because aging means ending. And the version of America that The Simpsons represents, the chaotic, dysfunctional, loving, infuriating, resilient middle-class American family that survives everything and resets after every catastrophe and shows up on the couch every Sunday night, that version of America is not allowed to end. Not in television. Not in the collective imagination of a culture that has been using this show as a mirror for 4 decades. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to make sure the walls are still holding and the family is still intact, and Bart is still 10, and Lisa is still 8, and Homer is still somehow employed at a nuclear power plant despite everything. And every time we watch, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for the show to do what stories are supposed to do, which is end. Because if it ends, if the timeline stops floating and starts landing, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and Maggie finally says her second word, then the show is over. And the show being over means admitting that the version of everything it represents, the particular combination of nostalgia and satire and genuine warmth that makes The Simpsons what it is, was always temporary, was always moving toward a conclusion. The way everything that has a beginning moves toward a conclusion, was always one birthday away from becoming something else. Section 12. The Final Mystery. Why can't we let them go? Craziness rating. Beyond the scale. We have spent several hours in Springfield. We have traced the geography of a town that exists everywhere and nowhere. We have sifted through the predictions that came true and the mechanism that explains them. We have reopened the shooting and left the verdict in the same uncomfortable state the evidence actually supports. We have looked at the full dark history of Ned Flanders's conditioned soul. We have counted Hans Mollman's impossible deaths. We have listened to the silence behind Maggie's eyes. We have followed the maintenance schedule that keeps a 140-year-old man alive. We have traced the conspiracy that runs from a biological weapons lab in 1969 through 3 generations of one family to a Sector 7G workstation that Homer Simpson has occupied for 36 years without once understanding. What put him there? We have stood at the center of the nuclear contamination theory and watched the full scope of it spread outward from those cracked cooling towers in every direction, touching everything and explaining more than any single theory should be able to explain. And we have followed Homer's coma down to the place where every other theory in this video eventually arrives. The sleeping man in the hospital bed, dreaming his family into permanent existence, because they are the only thing worth dreaming about. Every theory we explored reached a different conclusion, but every theory arrived at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental and structural and woven so deeply into the fabric of the show that it cannot be extracted without unraveling everything else. Something that has been accumulating across 36 seasons and close to 800 episodes, detail by detail, episode by episode, until the picture it forms is unmistakable, even if no single piece of it is definitive. The show has been telling you about this thing since the first episode, not through exposition or dramatic reveals, through accumulation, through the slow, patient layering of detail on top of detail until the weight of it becomes undeniable. Through the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers, and the voting to maintain a lie, and the coma episode, and the God conversation, and the crayon, and Mona's disappearance, and Maggie's silence, and the immortal old man, in the corner office. The Simpsons is not hiding its mysteries. It is showing them to you every single week. It always has been. The question is not what the mysteries mean. We have covered that. The question the show leaves you with, the one that stays after you have followed every thread to its end, is why the characters cannot see them. And the answer to that, the real answer, the one that underlies every theory and every piece of evidence and every impossible thing that happens in Springfield without consequence, is not the radiation or the coma or the collective denial or the billionaire's wealth. It is us. We are why the characters cannot see the mysteries. Because seeing them would mean the show had to respond to them. The characters noticing what is wrong with their town would mean the town would have to change or be destroyed or be saved, and any of those outcomes would end the story. We need the story not to end. We have needed that for 36 years. So Homer keeps not connecting his employer to his mother's exile. So the town keeps forgetting the dome and the sinkhole and the sun-blocking device and every catastrophe that should have permanently altered the texture of life in Springfield. So Burns keeps signing the checks, and the radiation keeps leaking, and the three-eyed fish keeps swimming in the river downstream from the cracked cooling tower, and nobody asks the obvious question. Because we are asking it. We are the ones who see it. We are the ones who trace the threads and develop the theories and sit with the evidence late at night when we should be sleeping, connecting the dots that the characters cannot connect, because connecting the dots would end the loop. The show does not need Homer to understand the architecture of his own suffering. It has us for that. The show does not need Lisa to finally receive the recognition her intelligence deserves. We recognize it on her behalf. The show does not need Maggie to speak. We have been listening to her silence for 36 years, and we have heard more in that silence than most characters manage to say in a lifetime of dialogue. We are the consciousness that Springfield lacks. We are the critical thinking that the radiation suppressed. We are the clear-eyed awareness that the coma dream cannot produce from within itself. We are outside the loop, able to see it whole, unable to stop watching it. Springfield is us. Homer is our father, in the sense that he embodies a specific kind of American weariness that most of us have encountered in the people who raised us, the weariness of someone who has absorbed too much over too long and whose defense mechanism is to not think about it too hard. Marge is our mother, in the sense that she is the person who keeps the whole fragile structure from collapsing through the sustained application of patience that she should not have to give. Bart is who many of us wanted to be, before we understood the cost. Lisa is who many of us suspect we should have been, before we understood what that cost looks like from the inside. And Maggie? Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden, the intelligence we learned not to show because showing it created resistance, the awareness we maintain behind a neutral expression because the world has not yet given us a sufficient reason to reveal it, the capability we hold in reserve because the moment for using it has not arrived. Maggie is waiting, so are we. That is the final mystery. Not a buried plot thread or a canonical contradiction or an unresolved clue. The mystery of why we cannot stop watching a show about people who cannot see what we can see, who cannot change in ways we have spent decades hoping they will change, who cannot age into the futures we have imagined for them and occasionally been allowed to glimpse. The answer is simpler than any theory. We love them. We love Homer for all the ways he fails and all the ways he tries and all the ways he wakes up the next morning ready to try again, without any particular understanding of what he is doing or why. We love Marge for the bottomless patience that the show has never quite adequately thanked her for, that most of us have never adequately thanked the real Marges in our lives for. We love Bart for the rebellion that we outgrew or suppressed or redirected, but never fully extinguished. We love Lisa for the idealism that the world keeps trying to knock out of her and that she keeps rebuilding, smaller and more defended each time, but always rebuilt. We love the house on Evergreen Terrace. We love the couch and the couch gag and the music and the opening credits that have been telling us we are home for longer than most of us can remember a time before them. We cannot let them go, because letting them go would mean acknowledging that the specific version of home they represent, the version we encountered at whatever age we first sat in front of the television and heard that opening theme, is already gone, has been gone, is in some cases in a landfill somewhere, or in a house that belongs to different people now, or accessible only in the specific way that the past is accessible, real but unreachable, vivid but untouchable. As long as The Simpsons is on, the loop floats. Bart is 10. The house is intact. Homer is coming through the front door at 5:30 after another impossible day at the plant, and the family assembles and the story begins again. We built this. We maintain it. We will keep watching. And Springfield will be here when we come back, whenever we come back. Whatever time it is, whatever state the world is in, it always is. That is the whole point. There is something worth examining in the way the question of Springfield's location has functioned over the decades as a kind of recurring cultural ritual between the show and its audience. Every few years, someone with credibility, a creator, a longtime writer, a cast member appears to offer a definitive answer. The answer gets covered. The internet briefly treats the mystery as resolved. And then the show continues, and the answer turns out not to hold, and the ritual begins again. This cycle has happened enough times that it seems to serve a purpose beyond simple inconsistency. The repeated false resolutions keep the question alive in a specific way. They remind the audience that the question exists. They generate renewed interest in the puzzle. They invite a new wave of examination and theorizing. And they do all of this without ever actually providing the closure they appear to promise. The show has been managing its own mythology for 36 years, and the Springfield location question is one of the places where that management is most visible. The mystery is maintained because the mystery is useful. An answered question stops generating conversation. An unanswered one, periodically stoked by near answers that dissolve under scrutiny, keeps generating it indefinitely. Consider for a moment what it would mean for the show's identity if the location question were definitively resolved. If Springfield were established, permanently and irrevocably, as being in Oregon or Missouri or Kentucky, something would shift in how the show sits in the cultural imagination. It would stop being everyone's hometown and become someone's hometown. The universality that has allowed people in different states, with different regional cultures and different economic circumstances and different relationships to small-town American life, to see their own experience reflected in Springfield, that universality would fracture along geographic lines. The question is not where Springfield is. The question is what it would cost to know. And the answer, arrived at by 36 years of sustained ambiguity, is that it would cost too much. There is a different dimension to the Springfield geography mystery that tends to get overlooked in discussions, focused on the state question specifically. It involves time as much as geography. Springfield does not just fail to stay in one state, it fails to stay in one era. The town's architecture shifts between episodes in ways that reflect different decades of American urban and suburban development. In some episodes, the downtown feels like a mid-century American Main Street, the kind that was built in the post-war boom and declined steadily from the 1970s onward. In others, it reflects the strip mall sprawl of the 1980s and 1990s. In still others, there are elements that suggest more recent commercial development, the particular aesthetic of the 2000s and 2010s suburban landscape. The show takes place in an eternal present that simultaneously contains every era of American architectural history. Springfield is not just located everywhere geographically, it is located everywhere temporally. The town is assembled from every version of American small city and suburban life that has existed across the decades the show has been airing, layered on top of each other without regard for the historical logic that would normally determine which buildings and which streetscapes belong to which period. If you think about this in the context of the coma theory, which we will reach in due course, there is a compelling resonance. A dreaming brain does not maintain strict temporal or geographic organization. It assembles its worlds from fragments of accumulated experience without sorting them into the categories that waking perception would impose. A dreaming Homer would produce a Springfield composed of every version of every town he had ever experienced or seen on television or driven through, layered and merged into something that feels familiar and complete, while being impossible in any strictly logical sense. The geographic uncertainty and the temporal layering together produce a Springfield that is not a real place and is not meant to be mistaken for one. It is an emotional location, a constellation of feelings about American life organized into the shape of a town. The feelings are real even though the town is not, and the feelings are universal even though any specific real location could only belong to the specific people who actually live there. That is what Springfield is. That is what it has always been. The question of where it is located on a map is the wrong question entirely. The right question is what it feels like, and the answer to that is familiar. Deeply, specifically familiar in a way that has nothing to do with having ever actually been there. Springfield is the place you grew up, reconstructed from the inside out by your own memory of what it felt like, not what it actually was. And that reconstruction, by definition, cannot be located on any map. The writer's educational backgrounds are worth dwelling on more than they typically do in conversations about the prediction phenomenon, because they point toward a mechanism that is more interesting than either pure coincidence or supernatural foresight. The Simpsons writing room has, across its history, contained an unusual concentration of people with advanced training in fields that are specifically concerned with modeling how complex systems evolve over time. Mathematics, physics, economics, political science, computer science, these are disciplines built around the identification of patterns, the construction of models that describe how systems behave, and the extrapolation of those models forward into conditions that have not yet been observed. People trained in these disciplines develop, as a professional habit, the ability to look at a current state of affairs and reason carefully about what it is likely to produce. When a mathematician with a background in theoretical physics looks at the state of American celebrity culture in the late 1990s and asks where it is heading, the answer is not a guess pulled from intuition. It is the output of a trained reasoning process applied to observable data. The conclusion that celebrity culture and democratic politics were converging toward each other in ways that would eventually produce celebrity candidates with serious electoral viability was not a prophetic insight. It was an analytical conclusion available to anyone willing to take the observable trends seriously and follow them to their endpoints. The Simpsons predicted Trump the way a good structural engineer predicts which bridge will fail, not through ESP, through understanding how loads accumulate and where the weak points are. This also explains the apparent consistency with which the show's more specific, correct predictions hold up under scrutiny. The ones that feel most prophetic tend to be the ones where the writers were tracking a trend that had specific, identifiable momentum and extrapolating it to a conclusion that was, in retrospect, nearly inevitable given the forces already in motion. The Trump escalator moment is the purest example. Trump had been building toward a presidential announcement for years. His political ambitions were widely reported and widely satirized, and the specific visual grammar of a billionaire descending from his tower to announce something grand was already part of the cultural vocabulary surrounding him. The show did not invent the image. It assembled it from elements that were already present in the cultural environment. What the show added was the frame, the context that made the eventual real event feel like the punchline of a joke that had been in progress since 2000. And that framing is what gets misremembered as prophecy. The joke was told first. The reality arrived second. The joke was so good that when reality replicated it, the audience experienced the reality as the punchline rather than as an independent event. There is a philosophical dimension to the prediction phenomenon that rarely gets examined, involving the relationship between fiction and reality in a culture that has been saturated by a single piece of media for longer than most of its members have been alive. The Simpsons has been telling stories about American life for 36 years. Those stories have shaped, in ways both large and small, how Americans understand the categories of their own experience. The corrupt billionaire, the incompetent government official, the nuclear power plant next door to the suburbs, the town that collectively forgets inconvenient truths, the family that survives everything and resets after every catastrophe. These are not just Simpsons tropes. They have become lenses through which the culture processes and describes actual events. When a real corrupt billionaire appears in the news, the cultural vocabulary for processing him has been shaped in part by 36 years of burns. When an actual government official demonstrates an extraordinary gap between their stated competence and their actual performance, the cultural vocabulary for that has been shaped by Wiggum and by Quimby and by the accumulated characterizations the show has offered of American civic dysfunction. When an environmental contamination story breaks, people reach instinctively for the visual language of Springfield to help them frame it. The show is not predicting the future. The show has become part of the architecture through which the future is perceived and described. And when reality produces something that the show already described, it does not feel like prophecy. It feels like coming home to a language you already know. That is different from prophecy. It is something more interesting. It is the specific influence of a cultural object that has been present long enough and pervasive enough that it has actually shaped the conceptual vocabulary of the civilization it was produced by. Springfield has become part of how Americans think, not just a show Americans watch, a frame Americans use, a set of references Americans reach for when they need to make sense of something that would otherwise be difficult to categorize. And in that sense, The Simpsons does not merely predict the future. In a small but real way, it helps produce it. There is a dimension of the Burns shooting mystery that tends to get lost in the focus on motive and physical evidence. It involves the institutional response to the crime itself, how the investigation was conducted, who controlled it, and what that control reveals about the structures operating beneath Springfield's visible surface. Chief Wiggum ran the investigation. This fact alone is worth sitting with. Springfield's chief of police is not an incompetent person by accident. He is incompetent in ways that are very specifically useful to the existing power structure. He closes cases without solving them. He arrests the most convenient suspect rather than the most likely one. He responds to the concerns of the wealthy with alacrity and to the concerns of everyone else with cheerful indifference. His policing style, if it can be called that, functions as a maintenance mechanism for the status quo rather than as a genuine enforcement mechanism for anything resembling justice. When Burns was shot, Wiggum managed the investigation. He controlled what evidence was collected, how it was interpreted, which suspects were pursued with vigor and which were cleared without serious inquiry. He declared the case solved on the basis of testimony from a man who had just woken from a coma, supported by a sundial reading. The victim himself described as coincidental and DNA evidence that pointed to a surname shared by multiple people in the family. None of this rose to the level of serious investigative work. None of it needed to. The institutional pressure on Wiggum to close the case quickly was not incidental to how the case was handled. It was the primary force shaping how the case was handled. Burns is Springfield's largest employer, its primary economic engine, its most powerful political donor, and the person whose operations employ directly or indirectly a significant portion of the town's workforce. A lengthy, rigorous investigation into who shot him would create exactly the kind of sustained public attention to his affairs that the power structure surrounding him was constitutively organized to prevent. A quick resolution. Any resolution served the interest of everyone with a stake in the status quo. Maggie was perfect, unchargeable, unjailable, already surrounded by public sympathy as the baby of the most recognizable family in town. Naming Maggie closed the file without opening any of the doors that a more thorough investigation might have unlocked. The DNA evidence that pointed to the Simpson family is worth examining on its own terms. An eyelash was found on Burns's suit. DNA testing identified it as belonging to a Simpson. Homer was arrested as a result. This sequence of events looks conclusive until you think about who had the resources and the institutional access to ensure that specific piece of evidence was found and interpreted in a specific way. Burns has private medical research facilities. He has personal physicians with advanced capabilities. He has an entire pharmaceutical division and a medical infrastructure that, as the show demonstrates repeatedly, operates well ahead of Springfield's general healthcare system. He also has, through decades of institutional corruption, relationships with virtually every civic body in Springfield that touches on any process he has reason to care about. It is not difficult, in this context, to imagine a scenario where the evidence that pointed to the Simpson family was not found so much as placed in a position to be found. Not fabricated in any crude sense, just arranged, slightly, in a way that directed the investigation toward a conclusion that served everyone who needed the file closed. This is not a theory the show asserts directly. It is a reading the show makes available by establishing, across hundreds of episodes, the scope of Burns's institutional influence. In a town where Burns owns the economy, the policing is at minimum tolerant of whatever serves his interests, and the available conclusion was one that cost him nothing and exposed nothing. The most natural institutional outcome is exactly what happened. The case was closed. There is also the matter of the contest mechanics that has never been fully accounted for in discussions of the mystery. Fox ran a national contest promising that the winner, the person who correctly identified the shooter from the clues in Part 1, would be animated into a future episode. The prize was significant and unusual. It was not cash. It was a specific form of cultural participation, the chance to exist within the show itself. Thousands of entries were submitted. The sample reviewed by the show's producers yielded not a single correct answer. Not one. Now think about what this means for the claim that the mystery was solvable from the available clues. If the clues genuinely and unambiguously pointed to Maggie Simpson, if the evidence was as conclusive as the show's resolution implied, then some meaningful percentage of the hundreds of thousands of people who engaged seriously with the puzzle should have arrived at Maggie. The clues were not obscure. The show was not hiding the answer in ways that required exceptional deductive skill. If Maggie was the logically inevitable conclusion of the available evidence, there should have been winners. There were none. The absence of winners is itself evidence that the clues did not do what the show claimed they did. They did not point clearly and unambiguously at a single correct answer that a careful viewer could identify. They pointed at a range of possible suspects, most of them more plausible than Maggie, in ways that led the vast majority of engaged viewers, people who had been actively thinking about the problem for the entire summer between parts 1 and 2, to conclusions other than the one the show offered. The one person who reportedly did identify Maggie, the college student who posted the correct answer on a Simpsons news group the night of the original broadcast, was never found. The production team acknowledged their existence, issued an open invitation for them to come forward on the DVD release, and received no response. The one person who got it right may have gotten it right through lucky intuition rather than careful deduction from the clues. Or they may have had access to information about the production that other viewers did not. Either way, the contest was a failure by its own stated terms. The mystery was not solvable from the available evidence in the way the show promised, and the answer the show provided, when it came, did not vindicate the investigation so much as terminate it. The greatest mystery in animation history was resolved rather than solved. And in Springfield, as we have noted before, those are two very different things. One more thread worth pulling. The show's treatment of the shooting in the years following the resolution has been notably ambivalent, in ways that suggest the writers themselves were not entirely at peace with the answer they gave. Beyond Homer's Season 18 confession, there are occasional moments across the run where characters reference the shooting in ways that leave the question slightly open, where the certainty of the official verdict gives way briefly to something more equivocal before the episode moves on. The ambivalence reads as intentional. The writers know what the evidence actually supports. They know the official answer is the answer they chose rather than the answer the evidence demands. And across 30-plus years of subsequent storytelling, They have occasionally let that knowledge surface briefly, obliquely, in ways deniable enough that no single moment constitutes a retraction before pulling back to the established position. The case is closed. The writers know it is not solved. The audience has been allowed to suspect this. And everyone has agreed, in the tacit compact between a show and its audience that has held for 30 years, to leave it exactly where it is, which is, perhaps, the most Springfield resolution imaginable. The Ned Flanders situation contains a layer that even attentive viewers sometimes miss, which involves the specific nature of the behavioral modification he received as a child, and what that modification was designed to address. Ned was not simply a difficult child in the way that many children are temporarily difficult high energy, resistant to instruction, emotionally volatile in ways that resolve as development progresses. The show suggests something more intense than that. His behavior was described in terms that imply a child who was genuinely dysregulated in a persistent and serious way from a relatively early age. The kind of behavioral profile that, in a contemporary clinical context, would prompt evaluation for any number of underlying conditions. His parents, committed to a parenting philosophy that categorically rejected discipline and structure, did not engage with this on its own terms. They did not seek to understand what was driving the behavior. They sought, through their chosen specialist, to eliminate the behavior's external expression. The goal was not to help Ned understand or manage his internal states. The goal was to make the internal states invisible. The psychiatrist they found appears to have been quite good at this, from a narrow technical standpoint. The conditioning worked. Ned became outwardly calm, patient, and positive. The internal states, the anger, the frustration, the volatility, were suppressed rather than resolved. But the suppression was effective enough that it held for decades under considerable strain. What this means for Ned as an adult is that he is carrying the full weight of everything that was suppressed in his childhood without having developed the capacity to process or express it. Every year that passes adds to the load. Every provocation that goes unaddressed, every wrong that goes unforgiven in any real sense, even as Ned performs forgiveness with perfect consistency, every death and loss and disappointment and injustice adds to what is behind the conditioning. The hurricane breakdown was not a single event that exceeded the capacity of his psychological structure. It was the accumulated weight of decades finally tipping the balance. The structure held until it did not, and when it broke, what came out was not just the rage of that particular moment, it was everything. The most haunting aspect of Ned's situation, viewed from a distance, is the way that his faith functions within it. Faith for Ned is not supplemental to his psychology. It is load-bearing. It is doing the work that his suppressed emotions cannot do, providing a framework that makes the suffering meaningful, that converts the injustice of his situation into a test rather than an indictment, that allows him to continue functioning by promising that the accounting will come, eventually, in some form that he can trust even though he cannot see it. This faith depends absolutely on God being present and engaged with Ned's life, paying attention, maintaining the terms of the implicit covenant that Ned has organized his entire existence around honoring, and the show gives God to Homer instead. This is the cruelest structural joke in the entire series, and the show never draws attention to it directly. Homer, who has done nothing to earn divine attention and would struggle to articulate why he deserved it, receives it freely and repeatedly. Ned, who has built a life around earning exactly this kind of attention and who has maintained that life at enormous psychological cost, receives silence. If Ned understood this, truly understood it, fully and without the mediating framework of his faith, the implications would be devastating. The faith is built on an expected exchange. Ned gives his full, conditioned, perfectly maintained obedience to a set of values and practices, and in return receives the meaning and connection that make the giving worthwhile. If the exchange is not being honored on the divine end, then Ned's entire psychological architecture, the conditioning, the faith, the suppressed emotions, all of it is in service of nothing. The show cannot let Ned understand this. If he did, the cage would have to break again, this time with no institutional mechanism available to repair it. So the knowledge is kept from him. Homer gets God, Ned gets silence. And the show moves on to the next episode while Ned waves from his front lawn, maintaining the facade with the particular cheerfulness of someone who has been doing it for so long that the facade has become load-bearing in ways it was never designed to support. His sons Rod and Todd are worth noting briefly in this context. They are being raised by Ned using the same values and the same framework that Ned himself was conditioned around. They are gentle children, obedient children, children who have internalized the expectations of their environment with a thoroughness that mirrors their father's. Whether the show intends this as comfort or as horror, two more people being shaped by the same system that produced Ned, before they are old enough to choose otherwise, is deliberately unclear. Springfield's capacity for reproducing its own patterns across generations is one of its most consistent features. The cycle continues. The cage is rebuilt in every new resident who grows up inside it. The Hans Moleman situation invites a specific kind of attention to the show's background population, the characters who exist at the edges of Springfield's social world, who appear in crowd scenes and background moments and brief foreground gags without ever becoming central to any sustained storyline. These characters form the ambient texture of Springfield, the human noise that makes the town feel populated and real. Most of them are consistent. They appear, they behave in recognizable ways, they function as recurring elements of Springfield's social fabric without generating independent narrative interest. Moleman is consistent too, in the sense that he always appears as the small, elderly man with poor vision and a tendency toward lethal misfortune. But his consistency exists across the specific impossibility of repeated death and return, which places him in a different category from every other background character. Consider what Moleman's existence says about the nature of death in Springfield more broadly. The show has always treated physical harm to its central characters with cartoonish resilience. Homer survives things that should kill him, recovers from injuries at impossible rates, absorbs damage that would be definitively fatal outside the specific logic of animated comedy. This resilience has been attributed by the nuclear theory to radiation-induced biological adaptation, by the coma theory to the protection of a dreaming mind that cannot allow the dreamer to die, by cartoon logic advocates to the simple conventions of the medium. Moleman's deaths are different in character from Homer's survival. Homer does not die. He sustains injury and recovers. Moleman actually dies. His body ceases to function in ways the show depicts with enough specificity to distinguish from mere injury, and then he exists again in subsequent episodes with no intervening explanation. If death in Springfield is a revolving door for Moleman, what does that mean for the town more broadly? Is Moleman uniquely affected by whatever mechanism produces his cycle of death and return, or is he simply the most visible expression of something that affects Springfield's entire population in less dramatic ways? The floating timeline, which prevents any character from aging, can be read as a form of the same phenomenon. Nobody in Springfield ages. In a biological sense, they are not subject to the normal passage of time through their bodies. They do not accumulate the cellular damage that normally produces aging. They do not deteriorate in the ways that constitute the slow, continuous dying that makes up a human life. They are frozen at specific biological states and maintained there, episode after episode, without the progression that characterizes every living thing outside this particular town. Moleman's death and return is the acute version of the chronic stasis that affects everyone. He experiences, in compressed and dramatic form, the cycle that the entire population is in, the cycle of ending and returning, of damage and restoration, of events that should have permanent consequences but do not. He is the show's most concentrated symbol of Springfield's relationship with mortality. And the fact that the show treats him purely as a background gag, never pausing to examine what his existence implies, is itself consistent with Springfield's broader strategy of normalizing the impossible. There is one other dimension to Moleman's situation worth examining carefully, which involves his stated profession and his position within Springfield's economy. When Moleman's occupation comes up, which it does occasionally, in background dialogue and brief foreground moments, the details are inconsistent across the show's run. He has been identified as being in various lines of work, none of which fully explains his continued presence in Springfield or his economic circumstances. He appears to live alone. His lifestyle does not suggest resources. His physical deterioration and his apparent age are in no way compensated by the kind of material stability that someone who had been working for 31 years in a healthy local economy might reasonably have accumulated. If Molman is genuinely 31 and genuinely appears as he does, then whatever process aged him catastrophically did not spare his economic prospects. He is poor as well as ancient-seeming. He is isolated as well as vulnerable. He is, in every dimension of his material and social life, at the bottom of Springfield's hierarchy. The radiation theory, applied specifically to mole men, suggests that his proximity to the contamination source was more direct or more prolonged than that of most Springfield residents, producing effects more extreme than the general population has experienced. His premature aging and his biological resilience death as a revolving door rather than a permanent exit are both consequences of an exposure so intense that it broke the normal relationship between biological processes and time in both directions simultaneously. He ages too fast. He dies too easily. He returns too readily. All of these are symptoms of the same underlying disruption, operating at an intensity that the more protected or the more biologically buffered members of the Springfield population have not experienced to the same degree. He is what the radiation does at its most concentrated. And he dies in the background of episodes about other people, and nobody notices, and the show moves on. Springfield has normalized this too. It has normalized everything else. The theory that Maggie's silence is a strategic choice rather than a developmental limitation gains significant support from a careful examination of how the show has handled the rare moments when she does communicate. Her first word was "Daddy," voiced by Elizabeth Taylor, deployed once, never repeated or built upon. The show treated the moment as a singular event, a cameo, a surprise, a brief window that opened and closed. But the choice of daddy as her first word is itself significant in a way that goes beyond the sentimentality of a baby saying her father's name. Daddy is a word of attachment, of claiming, of identifying a specific relationship. It is not an accident. It is not a random syllable that happened to emerge. It is, in the context of Maggie's observed intelligence, a deliberate communicative act directed at a specific person for a specific purpose. She chose to speak. She chose what to say. She chose the moment. That is not developmental language acquisition. That is strategic communication by someone who already understands the full communicative landscape and has chosen, on an ongoing basis, to operate within it without producing accessible verbal output. The pacifier itself is worth thinking about as a communication tool rather than simply a behavioral prop. Maggie's pacifier movement serves as a kind of gestural vocabulary throughout the show. Different movements corresponding to different emotional states, different levels of attention or alertness, different degrees of engagement with what is happening around her. Anyone who has watched the show with sustained attention has noticed that Maggie's pacifier is not simply a comfort object being used as a comfort object is typically used. It is an expressive instrument in a communicative system that does not rely on speech. She has constructed an entire nonverbal language, and she uses it with precision. The sophistication of the emotional nuance she conveys through facial expression and pacifier movement exceeds what most adult characters in the show manage through actual speech. She communicates more with less. And she communicates only what she chooses to communicate, to whom she chooses to communicate it, in ways that do not require her to reveal the scope of her understanding. Now consider the specific circumstances under which Maggie has chosen to act overtly, to step out from behind the disguise of infant passivity and do something that reveals her capabilities clearly. Every case involves either a direct threat to someone she cares about, a direct threat to something she has decided to protect, or a situation where the injustice is severe enough that inaction is no longer the optimal response. The daycare rebellion was motivated by the protection of a caterpillar, a creature at the threshold between one form and another, about to become something new. The Burns shooting, whatever actually happened, involved the most direct possible threat to her family's security and stability. The various moments across the show where Maggie's capabilities emerge consistently involve conditions that cross a threshold she has established somewhere in the calculation she is continuously running. Below the threshold, silence. Observation. The maintenance of the disguise. The accumulation of information. Above the threshold, action. Decisive, precisely executed, consistently effective. This is not instinctive behavior. It is a strategic framework being consciously applied to ongoing circumstances. Maggie has defined what matters enough to act on and what is best addressed through continued patience, and she has maintained that framework with absolute consistency for 36 years. The question of what sits above her threshold, what would finally and fully break Maggie's silence, is perhaps the most genuinely open question in the show. Not open in the sense of unresolvable, but open in the sense of not yet having been resolved by the narrative. We know the framework. We know how it has operated. We have seen the threshold breached in specific circumstances. We do not know what Maggie has concluded, across 36 years of observation, about Springfield itself, about what it is and what it has done to her family and whether that crosses the threshold she has set, about what an intelligence of her caliber, operating in quiet accumulation across 3 decades in a town whose deepest problems have never been adequately addressed, might eventually determine is worth breaking cover for. The mutation framework suggests something specific here. If Maggie's anomalous intelligence is the product of the same radiation exposure that diminished Homer's, then she is not just the most cognitively capable member of her family. She is potentially the only person in Springfield with both the intelligence to fully understand what the nuclear contamination has done to the town and the cognitive resources to figure out what to do about it. Lisa comes close. Lisa is brilliant, and her instinct has always been to investigate and expose and advocate. But Lisa's intelligence is legible, which makes it targetable. Maggie's intelligence is hidden behind an infant facade that nobody is looking past. If there is a person in Springfield who could see the full architecture of what Burns has built and sustain the strategic patience required to actually dismantle it, it is probably the 1-year-old sitting quietly in the corner, watching everything. The show may not intend this as a plot direction. The floating timeline prevents any character from developing in ways that would produce a sustained arc toward resolution. Maggie will not age out of infancy and reveal her full capabilities in any conventional narrative sense. But within the internal logic of Springfield's mysteries as a piece of the puzzle rather than a direction for the plot, Maggie's position is fascinating. She is the most capable person in a town that has been systematically managed into incapacity. She has the tools to understand her situation fully. She has the patience to maintain her position without acting prematurely. She has the will, demonstrated repeatedly, and she has been watching for 36 years. The thing she is watching for may already have come into view. We just cannot see it yet, because we are looking at the parts of Springfield that announce themselves. Maggie has always operated in the parts that do not. The question of Burns's relationship with the people who serve him is worth examining beyond the Smithers dynamic, because the full scope of Burns's human infrastructure reveals something important about how he has organized his survival across more than a century. Burns does not simply employ people, he collects dependencies. Every person in his inner circle is there because Burns has identified something they need financially, professionally, psychologically, and has positioned himself as the person through whom that need is met. The relationship with Homer is the most visible example. Homer needs job security and stability because his psychology demands it, and Burns provides that security in exchange for Homer's presence in the safety inspector role, which itself serves Burns's operational needs. The exchange is not articulated as such. It does not need to be. Both parties understand their positions without ever discussing them. This pattern extends throughout Springfield's institutional life. The political figures who receive Burns's support are people whose political viability depends on his financial backing. They serve his interests not because they were selected for ideological alignment, but because they were selected for need people who require what Burns can provide, who understand that the provision will continue as long as they remain useful, who have no credible path to political survival that does not run through him. The medical professionals who maintain Burns's treatments are, presumably, people with something at stake in the arrangement beyond their professional fees. The treatments Burns receives are experimental in ways that go well beyond standard medical practice. The physicians administering them are operating in legal and ethical territory that their continued professional standing depends on keeping quiet. Burns holds this over them not through any explicit threat, but through the simple fact that the arrangement's continued existence is mutual. He depends on them to keep the treatments coming. They depend on him not to expose the nature of what they have been doing. This is how Burns has organized everything around him. Not through loyalty. Loyalty is too fragile, too dependent on feeling, too vulnerable to the vicissitudes of individual circumstance. Through mutual dependency. Through the careful construction of arrangements where every party's interest is served by the continuation of the arrangement and damaged by its disruption. It is an extraordinarily sophisticated organizational strategy, and it has been running in some form for over a century. Burns has had time to refine it. He has watched people respond to loyalty-based power structures and seen them fail. He has watched people respond to fear-based structures and seen them produce resistance and eventual revolt. He has settled on something more stable, arrangements where everyone's self-interest is aligned with his own, where the natural force of each person protecting their own position produces, as a collective outcome, his protection. Homer's position within this structure is especially layered because Homer is useful in two distinct ways that reinforce each other. He is useful as an incompetent safety inspector, ensuring that the plant's violations continue unaddressed and the radiation keeps flowing. And he is useful as the son of Abe Simpson, whose silence about a specific crime was purchased with the guarantee of Homer's employment. Burns got two things from the Abe arrangement: the silence he needed and the employee he needed in a single transaction. The efficiency of this is characteristic. The Smithers dynamic, viewed through this lens, is less about Burns's indifference to Smithers's devotion and more about Burns's recognition of Smithers's structural value. Smithers's emotional attachment to Burns is not something Burns exploits in a cynical sense. It is something Burns has allowed to develop because a person with deep emotional investment in Burns's survival is more reliably vigilant about Burns's medical schedule than a purely professional assistant would be. The devotion is not manipulated. It is accommodated because it produces exactly the behavior Burns requires. Burns is not cruel to Smithers in the sense of deliberately causing him suffering. He is indifferent to Smithers's emotional experience in the way that a person who views all their relationships through a functional lens is indifferent to the feelings of everyone around them. What matters to Burns is what Smithers does, not what Smithers feels. And what Smithers does manage the schedule, monitor the condition, ensure the treatments come, is exactly what Burns needs to continue existing. The relationship works because it serves Burns. Burns has never needed it to be more than that. There is a reading of the Burns immortality situation that goes beyond the individual case and touches on something the show gestures toward without fully developing. The question of what happens to a town when one of its central organizing institutions, the primary employer, the primary power source, the primary economic foundation, is organized specifically around the survival of a single, extremely old person. Springfield's infrastructure, as the show repeatedly depicts, is not built to serve the town. It is built to serve Burns. The power plant exists to provide Burns with income and with the radiation source his treatments require. The political arrangements exist to protect Burns from accountability. The economic dependencies that keep the town's population employed and housed and fed are structured as byproducts of Burns's operations rather than as ends in themselves. This means that Springfield's welfare is perpetually hostage to Burns's continued operation. If Burns dies, or if his treatment schedule fails, or if the arrangement of dependencies he has constructed over a century collapses for any reason, the town loses not just its largest employer, but the entire infrastructure that organizes its existence. The residents of Springfield cannot afford to want Burns dead, not because they are satisfied with the arrangement or because they have chosen it freely, but because the arrangement is the only framework available to them, and disrupting it would cost them more than sustaining it, regardless of what sustaining it costs them. This is the closed loop at its most complete. Burns's survival is in everyone's interest, including the interest of everyone he is harming. The contamination is in everyone's water, but the plant that produces the contamination is also what keeps the lights on. The cognitive impairment is in everyone's brain, but the facility that produces the impairment is also what provides the paychecks. You cannot remove the harm without removing the infrastructure, and you cannot remove the infrastructure without consequences that affect everyone in the town. Burns designed this. Not consciously, perhaps, in any single planning moment, but across more than a century of accumulated decisions, each one optimizing slightly for his own position and his own survival, the sum is a town that cannot function without him and cannot hold him accountable, because functioning requires him to be accountable to nothing. It is the most complete power structure the show depicts, and it has been running, in some form, since before anyone currently alive in Springfield was born. The full scope of what Burns's pursuit of Mona Simpson produced is larger than the immediately visible damage to Homer's psychology and family structure, because Mona's absence from Springfield was not just an absence from Homer's life. It was an absence from the town's political and social life, the removal of one of the few people in Springfield's history who had demonstrated both the motivation and the organizational capacity to challenge Burns. Directly, Mona, in 1969, was not acting alone. She was part of a group, people who had been paying attention to Burns's operations and had decided that attention was insufficient, that action was required. The group had the organizational capability to plan and execute an infiltration of a secure facility, to obtain and deploy a specific biological countermeasure, and to execute the operation without casualties. These were not amateurs. They were people with skills and with networks, and with the kind of committed purpose that produces effective collective action. Burns's response to the raid was not simply to punish Mona. It was to destroy the network. By identifying Mona and reporting her to the FBI, Burns activated federal law enforcement against the group as a whole. The pursuit of Mona was both personal vengeance and strategic preemption, eliminating the organized opposition that had formed around his operations by removing its most visible member and forcing every other member to recalculate. The costs of continued activism in the face of federal interest. The raid succeeded operationally. The biological weapons were destroyed. Burns was not able to reverse this particular loss. But Burns won the longer game. The network dispersed. The organized opposition dissolved, and Springfield was left without the kind of sustained, organized challenge to Burns's operations that Mona's group had represented, the only such challenge in the town's history, as far as the show depicts. Think about what Springfield might look like today if Mona had not been forced underground. If the group had remained intact, if the organized challenge to Burns's power had continued beyond 1969, if there had been a sustained political movement within Springfield dedicated to accountability for the power plant and the biological weapons facility and the accumulated harm of Burns's economic monopoly, the contamination might have been addressed earlier, before it had saturated the environment as thoroughly as it eventually did. The cognitive effects on the population might be less severe, which means the town's capacity for exactly the kind of organized response that the contamination was suppressing might have been preserved. The closed loop might have been broken before it fully closed. Burns understood this. His response to the raid was not disproportionate to the threat. It was precisely calibrated to the actual danger Mona's group represented. Not the specific damage of the raid, but the precedent it set and the organizational capacity it demonstrated. Mona was not targeted because of the biological weapons. She was targeted because she had shown that organized resistance to Burns was possible. Eliminating her was an investment in the future. In a future where Burns could operate without the friction of organized opposition, indefinitely. Homer's inability to connect Burns, the employer, with Burns, the destroyer of his family, is therefore not just a personal tragedy. It is a symptom of the success of a strategy Burns put in motion 50 years earlier when he reported Mona to the FBI and ensured that the most capable opposition to his operations would be scattered and driven underground before it could mature. The brilliant and capable version of Homer, temporarily restored when the crayon was removed, would have been able to make this connection. That Homer would have understood the architecture of his situation. That Homer's potential political capacity, his ability to organize other workers, to articulate grievances, to build the kind of coalition that Mona's group had prefigured, was exactly what Burns's long-term strategy had been designed to prevent. The crayon in Homer's brain is convenient to Burns in ways that go beyond simply having a compliant safety inspector. A cognitively capable Homer, understanding his own position fully, would be a political actor. A cognitively impaired Homer is an economic unit. The difference between those two things is the difference between someone who might challenge the structure and someone who sustains it by showing up every morning without understanding why. Burns did not put the crayon there, but Burns ensured that nobody in Springfield's medical establishment had any incentive to find it. And Burns ensured, by destroying Homer's family at a formative age, and by maintaining the economic dependency that kept Homer employed and psychologically manageable, that even if the crayon had been found and removed, the man revealed beneath it would have had limited capacity to act on what he understood. The damage was multi-layered and redundant. Remove one layer and another holds. Remove that and another holds. Burns's investment in Homer's incapacity has been comprehensive. Mona's death, which came in a later season, carries a weight that the show handles with unusual directness. The scene is quiet and unhurried. Homer sits beside her and holds her hand and watches. There is no joke, no reset, no cutaway to something more comfortable. Just a man and his mother and 37 years of stolen time between them. The episode gives Homer something in those final hours that Burns spent 50 years trying to prevent him from having: clarity. Not the intellectual clarity of the crayon removal, but the emotional clarity of a person finally understanding, through direct experience, that the most important thing in their life was taken from them by someone else's decision, and that the taking was real, and that the loss is permanent. Burns wins the long games. Burns always wins the long games, but he could not prevent this scene. The scene happened. Homer held his mother's hand. The clarity entered him, even temporarily, even in a form he could not fully articulate or act on. It is a small thing against the scale of what Burns built. It is also real. Craziness. Rating 8.5 out of 10. Here is a question that The Simpsons has embedded in its visual design since the very first episode without ever framing it explicitly as a question. Why do the people of Springfield look the way they do? Not in the abstract sense of animation style, in the specific, internal logic sense of what the show is depicting about its characters within the world the show presents as real. The residents of Springfield share a set of physical characteristics: yellow skin, prominent eyes, characteristic overbites, 4 fingers on each hand, hair that maintains structural shapes without visible product or support, proportions that depart from normal human anatomy in specific and reproducible ways. And visiting characters from outside Springfield are drawn differently. More naturalistic proportions. Eyes positioned more normally in the face. Physical dimensions closer to actual human anatomy. The difference is consistent across 36 years of production. It is not random variation between episodes or animators. It is a stable, reproducible differential between the way Springfield residents look and the way everyone else looks. Within the show's own fictional reality, there is a visible, observable difference between people who live inside Springfield and people who come from elsewhere. The people inside the contamination zone look different from the people outside it. Begin with what the show has explicitly established about the Springfield nuclear power plant. A surprise safety inspection found 342 violations. The cost to bring the facility into compliance was estimated at $56 million. Burns declined to spend it not because the sum was beyond his means, but because spending it would require acknowledging the violation's existence, and acknowledging their existence would invite the kind of inquiry that might also address what those violations had already done to the population living downwind. The violations documented in the episode are not administrative oversights. They are fundamental safety failures. Radioactive waste dumped directly into bodies of water accessible to the public. Radioactive waste deposited on children's playgrounds. A plutonium paperweight on somebody's desk. Cooling tower structural failures patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats glowing. Visibly irradiated rodents moving freely through the facility's interior passages. And, dropped into the episode and never returned to, human skeletons in the basement. Bones in the basement of an operating nuclear reactor. The inspection found them. The show noted them. Nobody in the episode asked whose skeletons they were, how they had come to be there, or what had happened to those people inside a facility that has demonstrated, across every episode that depicts it, complete indifference to the welfare of the people within and around it. The safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this from having consequences is Homer Simpson. The show's own creator has stated that Homer's IQ is 55. He has a crayon lodged in his brain that has been physically reducing his cognitive function for decades. He sleeps at his workstation. He caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core because he wanted to see if radiation would make it larger. He is the barrier between 342 active violations and the people drinking the water downstream from the facility. Blinky arrived in Season 2. A three-eyed fish pulled from a river near the plant. The mutation is radiation-induced by the most obvious available explanation. The show acknowledges this directly through the political response the fish generates. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as evidence of environmental contamination. Burns eats the fish on television to dismiss the charge. The town moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts follow-up studies. Nobody asks what the three-eyed fish indicates about the water that produced it, which is the water the town drinks. In the Simpsons movie, the contamination has progressed beyond management by selective inattention. The EPA determines that Springfield must be physically sealed under a glass dome. The United States federal government classifies the entire town as an environmental hazard requiring physical quarantine. Every resident who has been drinking the water and breathing the air for their entire lives is inside the dome when it goes up. This is the scale of what the plant has been producing, within the show's own narrative. Now the theory. The contamination from the plant has been entering Springfield's environment continuously across the decades the show has been running. Every resident has been absorbing it through water, through air, through food grown in local soil, through the accumulated daily contact with an environment saturated with material. The facility has been leaking since it began operating. The effects vary based on biology and proximity and duration of exposure, but certain effects are consistent across the population. The physical characteristics that all Springfield residents share, the yellow skin, the prominent eyes, the four fingers, the proportional anomalies are not a coincidental aesthetic choice by the show's animators. They are what 30-plus years of environmental radiation does to a human population when that radiation is continuous and the people affected have no means of escaping it and no knowledge that escaping would be advisable. The outsider differential, the consistent difference in how visiting characters are drawn compared to residents' maps precisely onto this framework. People from outside Springfield have not been living inside the contamination zone. Their biology has not been subjected to the same sustained radiation exposure. They look different because they are different, biologically, in ways the contamination produced. Homer's physical resilience is the most visible individual expression of the mutation's effects. He has survived being shot, electrocuted, falling from heights that should be definitively fatal, being struck by multiple vehicles, surviving multiple explosions. His recovery rate exceeds anything possible for an unmodified human body. The radiation has not just altered his appearance and his cognition, it has altered his cellular resilience in ways that make him extraordinarily difficult to permanently damage at the cost of the cognitive function that was simultaneously being reduced. Burns knows all of this. He has the scientific resources to understand radiation's biological effects because he is personally dependent on managing its effects in his own body. His weekly treatments require sophisticated medical knowledge about how radiation interacts with biological systems. He has been developing and refining that knowledge for over a century. He knows what the plant has been doing to Springfield. He has always known. His choice to refuse the $56 million compliance repair is therefore not simply negligence or financial calculation. It is informed by an understanding of what those violations have already produced in the surrounding population and a judgment that the production has been useful. A cognitively impaired population is a manageable population. A population that cannot easily synthesize complex causal chains is a population that cannot easily identify the source of its own dysfunction. A population too damaged to ask why their fish have 3 eyes is a population too damaged to ask why their employer has been alive since before any of them were born. The contamination is not an unfortunate side effect of Burns's operations. It is a feature. The same facility that generates his income also manages his workforce's capacity for resistance. The same radiation that his weekly treatments harness for his own benefit seeps into the town's water supply, and the town's air, and the town's children's bloodstreams, producing exactly the population profile that serves his interests. Functional enough to work, impaired enough not to ask questions. The nuclear power plant is not a location in the show. It is the show's central mechanism. Everything that is strange about Springfield, every anomalous physical characteristic, every impossible recovery, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset traces back to those cracked cooling towers and the material they have been releasing into the surrounding environment across 3.5 decades of the show's run. The show has been showing you the mechanism since season 2. It drew you a diagram and named it Blinky and put it on the news, and then watched Springfield look at the three-eyed fish and move on. Springfield moved on, but the fish was still there. The fish is still there. The emotional core of the coma theory, the thing that makes it more than a puzzle to be solved and more than a narrative framework to be assessed for internal consistency, is what it proposes about Homer's inner life and what that inner life says about the show. Homer Simpson is not, by any conventional measure, a sympathetic figure in the way that literary protagonists are typically sympathetic. He is selfish and impulsive and frequently harmful to the people around him. He causes damage through negligence, through thoughtlessness, through the specific kind of injury that comes from someone who is focused entirely on their own immediate desires, without considering what those desires cost the people in their vicinity. He has caused genuine suffering, Maud Flanders' death being only the most extreme example, through nothing more than the automatic expression of his basic character. And yet, the show has always maintained that Homer loves his family. Not in a performed or conditional sense, in the specific, animal, total way that some people love the people they are closest to, a love that does not require expression or articulation, that exists as a fundamental orientation rather than as a series of choices that persist through every failure and every harm and every morning after every disaster. The coma theory takes this love and makes it the entire architecture of the show. If Homer has been unconscious since April 1993, then every episode since then is his mind doing the one thing it is capable of, with the cognitive resources it has left, holding the people he loves in existence, keeping the simulation running, making sure that Marge is still there, still patient, still herself, making sure Bart is still exactly as mischievous and alive as the last morning Homer was conscious enough to experience him, making sure Lisa's saxophone is still playing somewhere in the house, making sure Maggie is still small enough to hold. The dream does not give Homer wealth. It does not give him power or status or the resolution of any of the anxieties that have shaped him. It gives him his family. That is all the dreaming mind asks for. That is the entire content of the dream, from the first episode to the last, a family that is still there, intact, unchanged, present. The specific horror hidden inside this tenderness is the question of what it means for the family in the world outside the dream. If Homer is in a coma in Springfield General, his family exists on both sides of the dream boundary. They exist in the hospital, sitting beside him, watching the monitors, having lives that the dream is not tracking. Bart grew up, Lisa grew up, Maggie grew up. Marge has been living her life in the actual world, while Homer generated an imaginary version of it inside his unconscious mind. The dream family has not aged because Homer was not present to witness them aging, but the real family aged. The real Bart is in his mid-30s now, or his early 40s, depending on how long the coma has actually lasted. The real Lisa has finished school and chosen her life. The real Maggie has spoken and walked and become whatever she has become. Homer missed all of it. The dream preserved the version he knew, but the versions he knew were only real until April 1993, and everything since then has happened without him. The coma is not a nightmare, but it is not entirely a heaven either. It is a place where the thing you love is preserved exactly as you remember it, while the real thing continues elsewhere, changing and growing and doing what living things do, without you. There is a particular kind of grief in this that the show cannot quite name, because naming it would require acknowledging the theory's premise. A father whose dream of his children is 30 years behind the actual children, who holds the image of a 10-year-old boy, while the actual person who was that boy is somewhere in middle age. Who dreams of teaching Bart some lesson that Bart has long since either learned or abandoned? Who imagines comforting Lisa about some struggle that Lisa resolved or accepted or found new language for years ago? The love is real and total, and the object of the love is a photograph of something that has moved on. This is also, in a way that the show cannot fully escape, the experience of watching the show as someone who grew up with it. You love characters who have not changed while you have. You carry a version of them from when you were young, and that version is preserved in the episodes you watch then, while the actual show has continued to produce new episodes starring different iterations of the same characters. The Simpsons of 1993 and The Simpsons of 2025 are related, but not identical. The version you grew up with is somewhere in the archive, frozen at the age you remember it. The show is about a man dreaming his family because he cannot bear to let them go. And in watching it, we are the man dreaming. We are the ones who cannot let go. We are the ones keeping the loop running by returning to it, by treating the frozen version as the real version, by refusing to acknowledge that the thing we love has been changing while we were watching the preserved version of it. This is the coma theory's most complete contribution to understanding the show. It is not just about Homer. It is about the audience's relationship with the show. We are all in the same coma. We all went under at different moments whenever we first fell in love with the show. Whatever episode produced the specific attachment that made us return, and we have all been dreaming the family the same way ever since. Springfield is not Homer's dream. Springfield is ours, and every time we tune in, we choose to stay unconscious a little longer. The final episodes have not been written yet. The dream is still running. Homer is still in the hospital bed, or he is not, or it does not matter which is true because the functional reality for everyone involved, the dreamer, and the audience watching the dream is the same either way. The family is on the couch. The couch gag plays. We are home. We chose this. We will choose it again. The floating timeline has been studied, debated, and analyzed from a production standpoint more thoroughly than almost any other structural feature of the show. Writers who worked on it have discussed it. Critics who cover it have examined it. The standard account treats it as a practical decision with narrative trade-offs. It allows the show to stay perpetually contemporary at the cost of any possibility of genuine character development across the series as a whole. That trade-off is real. The show's most emotionally powerful episodes have always been the ones where some version of genuine change occurs within the confines of a single episode where a character reaches something or loses something or understands something they did not understand before, even if the understanding resets by the next episode. The coma theory would say that these moments of genuine change are the edges of the dream touching something real, the dreaming mind briefly accessing a truth about the world it is simulating, before the defense mechanisms pull it back to safety. But there is a dimension of the floating timeline that goes beyond the individual character level and involves the show's relationship with American history. The Simpsons began in 1989, at the end of a specific era of American life, the Reagan-Bush years, the closing decades of the Cold War, the particular configuration of class anxieties and cultural tensions that defined American life for the working and middle class in the late 20th century. Homer and Marge, as originally conceived, were products of that specific moment. A man who had a union job at a nuclear plant and a wife who managed the household on that single income, in a house they owned, in a neighborhood that functioned, in a town whose economy was organized around manufacturing and services in ways that could support this kind of life. This economic configuration was already becoming precarious by 1989. In the decades since, it has become nearly impossible. The kind of life The Simpsons represent: a working-class household with a single income, home ownership, a stay-at-home parent, 2.5 kids and a pet, a manageable debt load and a retirement that might eventually arrive, has moved from a realistic median American aspiration to a historical artifact. The floating timeline has insulated the show from having to acknowledge this transition fully. By keeping Homer and Marge in their mid-30s and updating the cultural references around them, rather than the economic circumstances, the show has maintained a configuration that is increasingly at odds with the actual economic reality of the American family. Homer should not be able to afford the house on Evergreen Terrace on a safety inspector's salary in 2025. Marge should not be able to be a full-time homemaker. The math does not work in the current economy. But the show does not do the math. The floating timeline allows it to preserve the economic configuration of the original setup while updating everything around it, producing a family that exists simultaneously in the present cultural moment and in an economic reality that corresponds to decades past. This is not just a production convenience. It is an expression of the show's thesis about what the American family is supposed to look like, and the deep cultural anxiety about the gap between that image and the current economic reality. The Simpsons represents a version of American life that most American families can no longer access. The house, the single income, the manageable stress level that allows Homer to spend significant portions of his day in comedic misadventures, rather than the grinding economic anxiety that would characterize his actual situation in the current economy. This version of life exists in the show in preserved form, available for viewing, producing the specific comfort of things being as they are supposed to be. The floating timeline is not keeping the characters from aging. It is keeping a specific version of the American dream from dying. As long as Homer is in his mid-30s and living comfortably on a single income in a house he owns, the version of American life that the show represents is still viable. The moment Homer ages into his 60s and Bart is middle-aged, and the house has been refinanced twice, and Marge has gone back to work, and the economic reality of the current moment has finally made its way fully into Springfield, the version of American life the show represents will have to be acknowledged as over. The audience does not want that acknowledgement. The show cannot deliver it. The floating timeline keeps both parties safe from it. This is the deepest purpose of the temporal stasis. It is not narrative convenience. It is cultural preservation. Springfield is a snow globe containing a specific configuration of American life, sealed against the forces that would otherwise have dissolved it, shaken periodically to make the snow swirl and the scene seem alive, returned to its shelf until next Sunday. The theories we have explored are all at their root about the same thing: the mechanisms that keep things frozen in Springfield. Radiation suppresses the cognition that would otherwise lead to change. The coma freezes the dreamer's world at the moment of unconsciousness. The collective denial votes away any truth that would require adaptation. Burns's immortality defies the biological time that normally dissolves power structures. The geographic uncertainty prevents the external accountability that would force the town to reckon with itself. All of these mechanisms serve a single function: the preservation of things as they are, the prevention of the kind of change that would require acknowledging what has been accumulating while change was being prevented. This is also what nostalgia does. And The Simpsons is, among many other things, a nostalgia machine. Not for a specific decade, the show is too contemporary for that, always updating its references, always topical. But for a specific emotional configuration, the feeling of being young enough that the world is still organized around you, that the adults around you are dependably themselves, that the house is solid and the family is intact, and everything that matters will still be there tomorrow. That configuration is what the floating timeline preserves. The characters are not kept young because the writers wanted to avoid the work of aging storylines. They are kept young because youth, in the sense of that specific emotional configuration, is the entire product the show is selling. Not youth as an age, but youth as a relationship with the world, a relationship defined by the stability of the people and places and things that constitute home. You cannot age that relationship. You can only preserve it or lose it. The floating timeline preserves it. Every other mechanism in Springfield assists the preservation. The loop is not a failure of the show. It is the show's most fundamental success. The show began with a promise. Here is a family, here is their house, here is their town, and they will be here every week, and they will be the same every week, and you can come back to them whenever you need something that does not change. 36 years later, the promise is still being kept. Bart is 10, Lisa is 8, Homer is coming through the door, the family is on the couch, we are home. We have always been home. We just did not realize until we had been gone long enough to notice how good it felt to come back. The show will end eventually. All shows end. Even The Simpsons, which has defied every expectation about how long a television series can run while maintaining an audience, will reach its final episode at some point. There will be a last couch gag, a last chalkboard gag, a last time Homer comes through the front door, and the family assembles for whatever the story of that episode turns out to be. The show has nodded at this, carefully and obliquely, in various episodes across its run moments where the frame of the show itself becomes briefly visible, where the artifice is acknowledged, where the audience is reminded that what they are watching is a construction rather than a reality. These moments are always quick and always followed by a rapid return to the show's default mode, the mode in which the fictional reality is treated as real and the frame is invisible. But they are there. The show knows it will end, the writers know it. The characters, in those brief metacognitive moments, seem almost to know it too. And the awareness that it will end is part of what makes the floating timeline feel not like avoidance, but like protection. The specific protection of something that will eventually be lost by someone who is not yet ready to lose it. Consider what the ending of The Simpsons would actually mean for the audience that has been watching it for decades. For people who began watching in childhood or adolescence, the show ending would mean the closing of a specific and irreplaceable connection to that time. Not just the show, the version of themselves that watched it then, the specific relationship with the world that existed when the show was new, the particular configuration of feelings and associations that accumulated around it across years of watching. The show is not just a show for those viewers. It is a repository of a specific period of their lives, accessible on demand, preserved in exactly the form it had when the preservation began. When the show ends, the repository closes. It does not disappear, the episodes still exist, still accessible. But the specific quality of a show that is currently airing, that is still adding to itself, that represents an ongoing relationship with a continuing story rather than a complete artifact, that quality disappears with the final episode. The show becomes historical. It becomes the thing it was, rather than the thing it is. And in becoming what it was, it becomes subject to the kind of temporal distance that changes everything about how it is experienced. You can still watch it, but you know, watching it, that there is no more coming. The container is sealed. What is inside is all there will ever be. And the relationship you have with it is no longer the relationship of two things in motion together, but the relationship of someone looking back at something that has stopped. The end of The Simpsons is, in this sense, a kind of death. Not the death of the show itself. The show becomes permanent in ending, becomes the classic that it will be for as long as television history is studied. But the death of the particular relationship between the continuing show and its continuing audience, the relationship that has been the most consistent feature of American television across the last 4 decades. That death will come. We know it will come. We do not know when, but we know. And every episode that airs in the meantime is, from a certain angle, a stay of execution another week before the ending begins. The mysteries we have spent these hours exploring are all, in different ways, about the same refusal. The refusal to end. The refusal to resolve. The refusal to let the accumulated weight of time and consequence settle into the kind of definitive conclusions that would bring the story to a natural close. Springfield resets after every catastrophe because resolution would mean ending. The characters do not age because aging leads to death and departure. The mysteries stay open because closed mysteries are complete, and completed stories are finished. The show keeps itself alive by refusing completion. Every open question, every unresolved thread, every mystery that deserves investigation and never receives it, each one is a reason for the story to continue, a reason for another episode. Another opportunity for something to happen that has not happened yet, even if what has not happened yet is simply the resolution of something that has been pending for decades. We participate in this. Every time we return to the show seeking the comfort of things unchanged, every time we express preference for the show maintaining its familiar configuration over the discomfort of genuine change, every time we treat the next episode as a continuation of the relationship rather than as a step toward its ending, we are choosing the loop. We are voting for Springfield to stay the same. We are maintaining the conditions that keep the mysteries open and the timeline floating and the family on the couch. The show reflects us in this. Springfield's inability to change is our inability to let it change. The residents' inability to see what is wrong with their town is our inability to look at the show with the kind of clear eyes that would force us to acknowledge the things it is saying about the culture it has been documenting for 36 years, about economic precarity dressed up as stability, about environmental harm normalized as background detail, about cognitive impairment dressed up as lovable stupidity, about the systematic management of a population by the concentration of wealth and the strategic deployment of dependence. The show has been saying these things since the beginning. It has been saying them clearly, with evidence, without metaphor, in episodes that anyone watching carefully has been able to see. The radiation is real, the contamination is real, the cognitive impairment is real, the 3-generation conspiracy is real. The immortal billionaire who has engineered a closed system of dependency and exploitation is real. Within the show's own logic, within the evidence the show itself provides, and Springfield does not see it. The characters cannot see it. They are inside the loop. We watch from outside. We see it. We tune in anyway, because the loop is home. Because Springfield, strange and impossible and quietly unsettling and built on foundations that do not bear close examination, is nevertheless the place we keep returning to, not despite what it is. Sometimes because of what it is, because a place that is that strange and that persistent and that familiar all at once is rare, and rarity has its own gravity, and the gravity keeps pulling us back. We cannot let them go. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, frozen on the couch, frozen in their specific ages, Frozen in the specific configuration of a family that has been together for 36 years without a single meaningful thing between them changing. We cannot release them from the loop, because releasing them from the loop would mean releasing ourselves from what the loop contains. The version of home it represents, the version of family, the version of a world where the house is still standing and the kids are still young, and the problems are, at their core, manageable, where everything resets and nothing is permanently broken. And the next Sunday brings another episode, another chance to be right, another chance to go home. Springfield will be here. When you need it, when you come back to it, whatever time it is when you do, Springfield will be exactly as you left it. The loop holds, it always will. Good night. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. Wherever you are right now, I hope you are warm and comfortable, and that the night is being kind. Take care of yourselves, and if you found this worth your time, you know what to do. Good night. End of script. Bonus section. The Skinner identity crisis and Springfield's relationship with truth. Craziness rating. 6.5 out of 10. There is an episode of The Simpsons that is widely and consistently ranked among the worst the show has ever produced. An episode that generated immediate and sustained backlash when it aired in September of 1997, and that has never been fully rehabilitated in fan opinion, despite the passage of more than a quarter century. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired as the second episode of Season 9. And the reason it makes this list is not that it is bad, it may be bad. That argument has been made by more qualified people than me, but that it is the single episode in the show's entire run that shows you the machinery of Springfield's impossible relationship with truth, live and in operation in real time. Every other episode that demonstrates Springfield's capacity for collective amnesia and selective reality does so after the fact. You see the result of the forgetting a catastrophe that has been absorbed without consequence, a contradiction that exists unremarked without seeing the mechanism. The Principal and the Pauper is the one time the show let you watch it happen. Here is what the episode depicts. Springfield Elementary holds a ceremony celebrating Principal Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. In the middle of the celebration, a stranger arrives. He identifies himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war and presumed dead, who survived and escaped and came home to discover that someone had been living his life for 2 decades. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before the war, he was a street kid from the wrong side of the tracks. A petty criminal with no future and no community, and no identity he was attached to. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a home or a family or an identity worth keeping, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the life, the mother. He lived inside the borrowed identity for 20 years, becoming in the process genuinely beloved, or at least genuinely present in ways that the original Skinner, a stranger, could not claim. When the real Skinner arrived, the town held a meeting. Everyone knew the truth. The imposter and the original were both present. The facts were not in dispute, and the town voted to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issued a legal decree. The imposter was officially recognized as the real Skinner. The real Skinner, the actual decorated veteran whose identity had been stolen, who had survived a prisoner of war camp and crossed the country to reclaim his life, was tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And Judge Snyder made it explicitly illegal to ever mention the truth again, under penalty of torture. Let that settle for a moment. A community in full possession of definitive proof that a prominent public figure had been living a stolen identity for 2 decades, made a collective democratic decision to suppress that truth, exile the person who embodied it, and criminalize any future acknowledgement of it. This is what the fans hated. They found it offensive to Skinner as a character, destructive to 20 years of characterization, and fundamentally inconsistent with any coherent narrative reality. Harry Shearer, who provides the voice for Skinner, expressed his displeasure publicly. Critics called it the moment the show stopped caring about its own continuity. But here is the reading that the critical consensus consistently misses. The episode is completely honest about what Springfield is. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable fictions over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed, implicitly and collectively, to forget whatever does not fit the established narrative. The Principal and the Pauper is not a betrayal of the show's values. It is the one episode that states those values explicitly, that shows you the vote and the decree and the exile, that makes the mechanism visible rather than leaving it in the background where it normally operates unseen. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe or ignores a fundamental contradiction, the forgetting happens between episodes. You see the catastrophe in one episode and the normalcy in the next, with nothing in between to account for the transition. The reset happens off-screen, in the gap between closing credits and opening titles, in the space the show treats as invisible. The Principal and the Pauper is the one time the show put the reset on screen. It showed you exactly how the mechanism works, through collective decision, through legal decree, through the physical expulsion of anyone who insists on the truth, and then it expected the audience to accept this as narrative logic rather than as the revelation of Springfield's foundational operating principle. The audience refused. They experienced it as a violation because it was the first time they were forced to watch the mechanism explicitly rather than benefit from its operation invisibly. But the mechanism is the same. It has always been the same. The episode did not break the show. It revealed the show. Every time Homer recovers from something that should be permanent and shows up the next week unchanged, the mechanism is operating. Every time a catastrophe that should reshape the town leaves no trace in the subsequent episode, the mechanism is operating. Every time a major revelation about a character is introduced and then quietly dropped, never mentioned again, treated as though it did not occur, the mechanism is operating. Springfield resets because Springfield votes to reset. Because acknowledging the accumulation of events and their consequences would require acknowledging the full picture of what Springfield is and what has been happening there, and the full picture is too destabilizing to sustain the social contract that allows the town to function. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He arrived with proof that the town's understanding of its own reality was built on a fiction. His presence was a threat not because of anything he personally intended, he just wanted his life back, but because his existence made the lie visible in a way that could not be ignored while he was present. The town did not engage with the truth he brought. The town exiled him. He is out there somewhere, tied to a railroad car, expelled from the life that was taken from him, the last honest man in a town that made honesty a criminal offense. This is not a metaphor. It is a plot event that the show depicted explicitly and then expected its audience to process as comedy. And the audience, for the most part, processed it as bad writing, rather than as a brutally clear articulation of how communities maintain their impossible realities. The episode is not the worst in the series. It is the most honest. Bonus section, the yellow skin question, and the human behind the color. Craziness rating, 4.5 out of 10. The yellow skin of Springfield's residents is the show's most consistent and most analyzed visual characteristic, and also the one most frequently dismissed as a purely aesthetic production choice without further significance. It was Matt Groening's early design decision, intended partly for visibility on the small television screens of the late 1980s, and partly as a visual marker of the show's departure from naturalism. Yellow skin reads immediately as artificial, as cartoon, as not meant to be mistaken for documentary footage of real people. That is the production rationale. It is real and it was deliberate. But within the show's internal logic, the yellow skin of Springfield's residents is one of the most consistent pieces of evidence supporting the nuclear contamination theory, and the specific way it is deployed across episodes reveals more about the show's awareness of its own implications than any other single visual element. Consider the precise pattern of who is yellow and who is not. Springfield's permanent residents are yellow. Every single one, without exception, regardless of their ethnic background or any other individual characteristic. The yellow skin is universal among people who live in Springfield. It does not reflect any real-world ethnic category. It is something that all Springfield residents share regardless of any other distinguishing feature. Visiting characters from outside Springfield are not yellow. They have skin colors that correspond to the full range of human appearance, various shades and tones that reflect their depicted backgrounds. They look, in this specific way, like more realistic depictions of people than the Springfield residents do. The show could have made everyone yellow, treating the yellow skin as a consistent stylistic choice applied to all animated humans regardless of origin. It chose not to. The differential is deliberate. Visitors look different from residents. The visual language of the show distinguishes between people who live inside Springfield and people who come from outside it, using a specific physical characteristic that appears in one group and not the other. Within the logic of the show's world, yellow skin is something that happens to you when you live in Springfield. It is not an ethnic characteristic, not a stylistic artifact, not something that applies to all animated humans. It is something Springfield-specific, something that the environment produces in the people who inhabit it. The nuclear contamination framework proposes that jaundice, which is what yellow skin is in a medical context, the visible result of elevated bilirubin in the blood, typically indicating liver stress or dysfunction, is one of the visible effects of chronic radiation exposure on the population. The liver processes environmental toxins. A liver under chronic stress from environmental contamination produces the yellowish coloration visible in all Springfield residents. The more severe the contamination, the more pronounced the coloration. People who visit Springfield briefly do not accumulate enough exposure for the effect to be visible. People who have lived there their entire lives show it universally. This reading transforms the show's most iconic visual element from a production choice into a symptom. The yellow skin that makes The Simpsons look like a cartoon is, within the show's own internal logic, evidence of chronic liver stress in an entire population exposed to decades of radioactive contamination. Homer is yellow because he has been drinking the water for his entire life. Marge is yellow for the same reason. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were born yellow not because cartoon babies are yellow, but because their parents were already contaminated when they were conceived, and the contamination that shaped their parents' bodies shaped theirs from before birth. The one exception that proves the rule: Maggie's intelligence. If the yellow skin indicates contamination, and if the contamination affects cognitive function in the way the theory proposes, then Maggie's anomalous intelligence, the intelligence that exceeds the contamination's suppressive effects, represents a biological response that went in the opposite direction from everyone else in the family. The contamination suppressed Homer's cognition. It appears to have enhanced Maggie's. The yellow skin is on her too, but whatever the radiation did to her brain did not follow the pattern it followed in everyone around her. She is the outlier in a population of outliers. The mutation that went the other way. Yellow as Springfield, yellow as contaminated, yellow as home. The color has been there since the first episode. You have been seeing the evidence for 36 years without necessarily reading it as evidence. Bonus section, the vending machine, the crayon, and the cost of awareness. Craziness rating, 7 out of 10. The crayon episode, the episode in season 12 where Homer's crayon is temporarily removed and his IQ rises dramatically, is the closest the show has come to directly addressing the nuclear contamination theory from the inside, and it is worth examining in detail because of what it shows about the show's awareness of its own implications. Homer, without the crayon, is a genuinely different person. Not just smarter in an abstract sense, differently oriented to the world around him. He notices things he did not notice before. He processes information with a speed and depth that the show depicts as almost visibly overwhelming, as though the cognitive infrastructure that was previously blocked by the crayon is suddenly available and receiving more input than it knows what to do with. He understands his job for the first time, what he actually does there, what the safety inspector role actually involves in a facility like the nuclear plant, what the violations he has been ignoring actually mean for the people who drink the water downstream. The episode does not spell this out in clinical terms. This is still a comedy, but the implication is clear enough. Homer, with his full cognitive capacity restored, is looking at the same information he has always had access to and suddenly understanding what it means. He also understands his life, his marriage in its complexity and its dependency and its genuine depth, his children in their specific natures and their specific needs, and his specific failures to meet those needs as consistently as they deserve, his father, and the particular kind of damage that being raised by Abe Simpson produced, his position in Springfield's economy and his employer's interest in maintaining that position precisely as it is. He sees everything, and it is unbearable. The episode is careful about why it is unbearable. It is not simply that intelligence produces sadness as a necessary side effect, or that knowing more makes you less happy in some mechanical way. It is specifically that seeing Springfield clearly, with full cognitive capacity, reveals a picture that is too heavy to carry. The contamination, the exploitation, the ways that the people around Homer have been shaped by forces they cannot see and do not understand. The specific ways that Homer himself has been shaped by those forces, has been deployed as a tool of them, has spent his entire adult life reinforcing the conditions of his own harm without any awareness that this is what he was doing. Intelligent Homer cannot unknow these things. He cannot choose not to see what his restored cognition shows him. And the weight of seeing it, without the cognitive softening that the crayon provided, without the specific mental limitation that allowed Homer to simply not process the implications of what he observed, is more than intelligent Homer can sustain while also functioning in the world he now understands so clearly. So he puts the crayon back in. He chooses cognitive impairment over clear sight. He chooses the fog over the clarity. He chooses to not know what he knows, to not see what he has seen, to return to the manageable ignorance of life as Homer Simpson without the full picture. This is the most honest moment in the show's exploration of why Springfield stays the way it is. It is not that the residents of Springfield are incapable of understanding what has happened to them and what is happening to them. They are. The cognitive impairment produced by decades of radiation exposure has genuinely reduced their capacity for the kind of analysis that would allow them to see the picture fully. But even if you remove that impairment, even if you restore the cognitive capacity that the contamination suppressed, you do not automatically produce someone who can act on what they now understand. Because understanding what Springfield is, really understanding it fully, means also understanding the cost of that knowledge. It means seeing the closed loop and recognizing that breaking it would mean dismantling the economic and social structure that everyone in Springfield depends on for their daily functioning. Intelligent Homer saw all of this. He saw what the nuclear plant was. He saw what Burns had done to his family and to the town. He saw the three-generation conspiracy and the institutional corruption and the ecological catastrophe and the cognitive suppression and the complete picture. And he concluded that the cost of knowing was higher than the cost of not knowing. He chose Springfield. He put the crayon back in. He went home to Evergreen Terrace, to Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, to the couch and the television and the beer that was always cold. He chose them over the clarity that seeing them fully had cost him. This is not stupidity. It is a choice that every person who has ever returned to something they understood clearly and chosen to look away from will recognize. It is the choice to preserve what you love over the clarity that would require you to change it or lose it. Homer's crayon is the show's most precise symbol. It is not a symbol of ignorance. It is a symbol of the specific sacrifice that some people make in order to remain capable of love in the form that love takes for them, the form that requires a certain amount of not looking, a certain maintenance of the fog, because without the fog, the weight of full clarity would make the love impossible to sustain. We all have crayons. Some of us have chosen to leave them in. Springfield will be here when we come back. It always is. Extended outro. The loop, the light, and the long drive home. There is a specific experience that many longtime Simpsons watchers describe, a moment that tends to arrive after a period of sustained viewing in the late hours, when the conscious mind relaxes its defenses and allows the show to do what it does best, not entertain. Exactly. But accompany. The experience is something like the feeling of being in a place that has absorbed decades of the same sounds and the same conversations and the same emotional textures, until the place itself seems to hold them, the way old houses hold the warmth of the people who have lived in them. Springfield, after enough episodes viewed at enough late hours, begins to feel like a place in this sense. Not a real place. The geographic impossibility prevents that forever, but a place nonetheless. A location you can return to, a destination with a specific ambient quality, the particular texture of the Simpson house in the late afternoon, the specific gold of Springfield light in the establishing shots that open certain episodes, the way the tire fire's orange glow sits on the horizon at dusk, visible from the freeway on the way home. The show has built this atmosphere across thousands of hours of content, and the atmosphere is its most valuable product. Not the jokes, though the jokes are good. Not the satire, though the satire is often brilliant. The atmosphere. the sense of returning somewhere familiar. The ambient warmth of a world you know well enough that you can stop paying close attention and simply be present in it. This is what the sleep content format understands about The Simpsons that other formats miss. The show is not primarily a vehicle for plot delivery. The plot is the excuse. The texture is the product, and the texture is built from 36 years of accumulated detail. The specific sound of the opening theme, the specific look of the Simpson house's exterior, the specific quality of the light in the kitchen where Marge makes breakfast, the specific rhythm of Homer's voice when he delivers a line that could be read as either profoundly stupid or profoundly honest, depending on how much attention you are paying. The mysteries are part of the texture. They are not disruptions of the atmosphere, they are contributions to it. A world without mysteries, a world where everything is explained and nothing is left open,